Okay, so welcome everyone to our interpretation training. I'm really excited about this training. I think it's such an important skill that all master gardeners need, especially if you're working out in the garden and engaging with folks while they're actually on your site. I think this is just such an incredibly valuable skill for everyone to have. And we just haven't had a training on it yet. So we're so excited to have Angela here. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to go over a couple logistics for those that maybe aren't familiar with the webinar platform. So first of all, as I mentioned, your mics and cameras are turned off. You won't be able to turn them on. If you want to chat amongst each other to fellow attendees, we do have about 35 folks on board with us today. So if you like to chat with your fellow attendees, you can put that in the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, you can put those into the chat box as well. And if you have questions specifically for Angela regarding the content of the presentation, please put those into the Q&A box. That makes it a little bit easier for us to keep those questions separately, and it makes our Q&A time go a lot quicker so we can make sure we get everything covered. So within the Q&A box, you can see questions that fellow attendees have asked, and you can actually upvote them if you have the same question, or you can comment if you have a comment about their question or a related question. So definitely still ways for all of us to interact together today. So make sure you talk with your fellow folks. And if you have a question for Angela throughout her presentation, just go ahead and put it into the Q&A whenever you have the question, and we'll just take it whenever we get to our breaking points for Q&A before we take a break for everyone to step away for a little bit. So as I mentioned, I am recording this, and the recording will be available online on the Master Gardener Continuing Ed webpage, and we'll also make it available on the HGIC YouTube channel. So that will be available not just for folks who watch today, but for everybody else as well. So with that being said, we're excited to welcome Angela. I suppose I'll go ahead and introduce myself too in case folks don't know me. So my name is Stephanie Poley, and I am the state coordinator for the Master Gardener program. I've just been having a blast coordinating all these trainings this year and being able to have a lot of attendees join us online. We've done a couple in person this year, later in the year so far too. That's been really nice to get out there and see everybody. So if I haven't met you, nice to meet you, and hopefully I'll be seeing you in person sometime soon. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our excellent speaker for today, who comes very highly recommended by our fellows in the Master Naturalist program, which is another University of Maryland Extension volunteer program. So Angela Yau is the Nature Program and Facility Manager at Locust Grove Nature Center. And she's been leading interpretive programs, teaching about interpretation, and working between parks and farm museums for over 25 years. She actually taught me interpretation when I went through the Master Naturalist training program, and she was excellent. She's a certified interpretive trainer with the National Association for Interpretation. She's also an interpretive coach with the National Park Service. And she's passionate about helping people communicate more effectively for conservation of natural, cultural, and historical resources. So she really is a perfect fit for our program, and the skills that she's going to teach us today, I know, are just going to be so incredibly valuable. So Angela, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for having me today. And so glad you were one of the previous Master Naturalists who's heard the short and sweet interpretation presentation. So I want to welcome you all this morning and to getting to know interpretation. Kind of what is this word used all about that we're using in a different way than you've probably heard it used before? And also kind of giving you hopefully a toolbox of some things that you can use when you're working with audiences, when you're sharing your resource in gardens, or if you're in parks or other sites where you're hosting programs and talking about your resource. So in interpretation, we talk about the resource as many different things, and we're also using this word. So I will be getting into all those pieces. We'll be breaking down the definition. We'll be getting to know kind of the really basic principles of interpretation and giving you some acronyms and tools to help you remember some of these details. And we will be using a few of the tools here in Zoom. Like Stephanie said, you can put questions in the Q&A. but I'm also going to be asking you some questions. And for those, you can put them in the chat, and I think Stephanie will help me wrangle that chat and keep track of responses and what's coming in. So it is a little tricky on the webinar format because I love to ask questions. So if we're in a live setting, I make you do at least a third of the talking, but it is a little, back and forth here with the tools that we have. But it's been wonderful to have these kinds of tools to get us through the last 2 years, certainly. So a little bit about myself. Stephanie introduced me, but I've worked, when it said museums and farm museums and parks, I kind of want to explain that I've jumped back and forth. So I'm one of a handful of people in the country who's pretty much equally done cultural and historical resource interpretation and natural resource interpretation. And sometimes they're treated as two very separate things, but they're actually completely intertwined. I think anybody who understands our natural world knows that we have almost no places left on this planet that haven't been touched by humans and impacted by that interaction. So I really look at the two as completely intertwined, but I thought for Master Gardeners, it was particularly relevant to tell you guys about most of my museum experience and historic experience has been in the farm museum context, which is a special category. It actually has its own professional association, ALFAM, which is the Association for Living History, Farms and Agricultural Museums. So I've always worked in that space where we're kind of interpreting and sharing history in addition to talking about food. Where does food come from? And really sharing that food source and agricultural interpretation as well, just in that context of being at a farm site. So I started in Gainesville, Florida, and worked there for 10 years for the City of Gainesville Nature Operations Division. And there it was a really interesting mix of skills because I came to this with a background in wildlife ecology and conservation, and decided to specialize on the communication piece of that. And when I was working there at the site, we were at a nature center, we were getting to do nature programs, but on Thursday, Friday, I might be doing spring ecology with a school group. But then on Saturday and Sunday, I was a woman in 1870 at the Living History Farm. So as part of my master's project, I got to create a holistic interpretive planning model for all of our parks in the city park system, and then apply that model in writing interpretive plans for the system as a whole, and then for each piece of it, which included the Living History Farm. So it was a very different process to create an interpretive plan for something that's covering kind of those historical, cultural, and agricultural resources than what it was for necessarily the natural resources. The natural resources in many ways are much more straightforward when it comes to the interpretive planning process. So I'm coming from kind of both sides of that. I went from, that's what got me into living history and kind of got me appreciating history in a completely new way that I didn't get from school. And getting to really have that visceral hands-on experience kind of drove me through the rest of my career. So since then, I've sort of bounced between places. My most recent previous job was as the executive director at Stepping Stone Farm Museum, which is in Susquehanna State Park. So that's a small nonprofit museum in the park. And then from there, I came to Montgomery Parks. So that's where I work now at Montgomery Parks as a nature program and facility manager at Locust Grove Nature Center. So I'm back working every day in the nature side of things, but I still go do a lot of living history stuff on the weekends for fun. So kind of back and forth between the two worlds. So I really hope that this applies well to my particular audience today, because you guys being master gardeners are working in sites and really talking a lot about plants, talking in depth about plants. And I know that you're bridging both horticultural species, those agricultural species that we might have when we're at farm sites and living history sites. So you probably have opportunities to do some volunteer work there. A lot of those sites are heavier into ag education than you would think. So you might be surprised at how much is being offered at those kinds of sites. And then also my third love is native plants. And the native plants kind of overlaps into what we do with nature centers. So again, you guys might find wonderful volunteer opportunities with nature centers and getting to understand how native plants function in the ecosystem. I literally just heard Friday, I was doing an presentation for a master naturalist group, And a gentleman there came and said that he's confronted this big issue where they can't find landscape contractors who actually understand native plants and understand the needs of native plants and how that landscape should be managed, how it should be maintained, and really just finding people to help businesses to help people implement this landscaping change that they want to make as you're moving forward in what we're really doing a great job of teaching the public about how important native plants are and how important it is to create these microhabitats all across our landscape through our yards and through all the private property that's owned. So that's a whole movement of its own, but I think maybe master gardeners could have an excellent role in helping spread that education and maybe even getting some professional development out there for landscape professionals so that there are resources available, so that a citizen who might not physically be able to dig all the holes and plant all the plants can still switch to a native landscape if they chose and have the support to do that. So that's just a little bit of my background, kind of where I'm coming from and how I think it relates to master gardeners as an audience. And I really hope you guys can get a lot out of what we're talking about today. So we're going to jump right into interpretation. This word you might have heard in a different way. When you guys think of interpretation, you might think of sign language interpretation. You might think of language translation. There's a lot of places that word has been used, but in our field for our profession, we use it in a kind of different way. And we blame John Muir for that. So it was John Muir who said, "I will interpret the rocks and the trees." So he used the word in this different way to talk about how you're speaking on behalf of the resource. And in using this word in that different way, he was really embracing something that was happening that he was doing differently. So rather than just walking people outside and identifying things, he was really telling the story of the place to help people connect to it. And the Park Service identified that this was a unique thing that was happening. It was guys like Enos Mills and John Muir who were out leading people into places, natural places, giving these guided trips, these guided hikes. And from that, they were then creating conservation. So those people who went on their hikes and their walks came back and said, "I want to preserve this. How can we make this a park? How do we preserve it in perpetuity?" And so the Park Service realized that this was a really great thing. We wanted to do more of it, but they determined that they needed to identify what this process was. What are these guys doing that is really creating this emotional change, creating this action, this call to action? And so they hired Freeman Tilden to go out and look at all these walks and all these things that were happening and to start to define it and percolate it down into a process. How is this a thing that is teachable that we can use going forward with different audiences? So they went out and Raymond Tilden surveyed all of this. He pulled all this information together and he wrote the book, Interpreting Our Heritage. And so we consider Freeman Tilden kind of the grandfather of interpretation just for bringing it all together and really to refining the process. So when we talk about the principles of interpretation, those are coming initially from Tilden and initially from this work. Now, this work was done in the 40s, so the language is a little obtuse to the modern ear. Sometimes we want to kind of define it a little bit, break it down, make it focused, and really make it something that we can understand well in the current context. So when I referred to some of these guys who were out doing different work, Enos Mills said that a guide's chief aim was to arouse permanent interest in nature's ways. And this is by illuminating big principles. So again, the language sounds a little bumpy to us today, but really he's talking about getting to that aha moment, getting to that change in behavior, that creating connection that lasts. And Tilden told us that interpretation is revelation of a larger truth that lies behind any statement of fact. So that revelation is one of those ideas we're going to carry forward when we look at interpretation. So there has been a big change. Many years ago, NAI, the National Association for Interpretation, along with several other organizations who do this kind of work and who do environmental education and ecotourism and lots of related types of work. They all sat down together in a room, and there was a thing called the Definitions Project, where they kind of hammered out what were those definitions for all of these different things that were kind of interrelated and connected, but also distinct in their own way. And so in that process of creating those definitions, the definition that NAI is using for interpretation is that interpretation is a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. Now, I love to break this definition down because this really gives us all those key pieces for how we're creating interpretation. So, mission-based communication process. It is focused on a mission. It is supporting the mission of your site. It's the what, like why are you doing this here? What are you communicating? And how is it relevant to the place that you're communicating it? So that mission-based piece is when we talk about things like mission and goals and objectives, the purpose of interpretation, and how it's supporting the site where it's being offered. It's a communication process. So a process means that it isn't one way. It's a back and forth with your audience. You're really getting to interact with them. You're drawing from their experience and their interest, and you're helping to engage them in the process. Then we're creating both emotional and intellectual connections. So we're aiming to touch both hearts and minds. This is kind of where interpretation varies from education. And I have had a few educators really have trouble with this concept that it's different. And they're typically coming from something more like a Montessori background. So I would argue that yes, education, when done right, is touching both hearts and minds. It is reaching both pieces. But looking at the formal definition of education and formal education, where it's about the intellectual side, understanding the information, digesting the information, maybe spitting the information back on a test, whether you think that's the right way to go or not, that is kind of the formal education system. And they're not always aiming to make you emotionally change, where interpretation is aiming to create both that emotional and that intellectual connection. So it's also looking at the interests of the audience. So we care about our audience. We look to our audience first. It's our audience that's going to help us determine how to best meet them. We're reading our audience. We're trying to bounce off of their ideas and really understand where they're coming from and be able to respond to them on the fly. So this is the flexibility piece of interpretation, that we want to be able to connect to the audience in all these different ways. And we're also looking at the meaning inherent to the resource. So the resource was used here on purpose because it means many things. And resources, as I said, could be cultural, historical, a place. It could be the natural resources in a particular site. So it's whatever meaning that those resources are bringing that you're going to be communicating as the interpreter. So I like this definition because it did have all those nuts and bolts. However, we have a new definition. So just a couple months ago, NAI board has worked for about 3 years on changing and updating the definition of interpretation. And so I also wanted to give you guys the new definition. And the new definition that we're working with the National Association is that interpretation is a purposeful approach to communication that facilitates meaningful, relevant, and inclusive experiences that deepen understanding, broaden perspectives, and inspire engagement with the world around us. So you can see where this is kind of a broader wording for the definition, but it's also meant to bring in a lot of the newer trends. So I'd say in the last 5 years or so, interpretation has really strongly been shifting to incorporating our audience, to including things like dialogic interpretation or facilitated dialogue, 2 different words you'll hear for that process, where we're sitting down and having a conversation with our audience, especially around controversial issues. This really can be powerful for shifting perspectives and broadening perspectives and really getting a more comprehensive view of the problem and helping the audience to be included so that everybody's viewpoints are being heard and everybody's a part of that process. So I'd say that's a relatively newer trend, but further back than that, even for the last 15 years or so, interpretation has really been pushing to make sure that we're telling a complete story, that we're telling a complete history. So particularly, I think at our historic sites, probably more so than our natural resource sites, there's been a movement to make sure that we're telling a complete history, that it isn't just what's written in a history book for elementary school. We're actually getting beyond that. And there always have been site-specific histories and site-specific stories that are very important and very meaningful. But we're now aiming to make sure that we're inclusive in having all perspectives on that story and all parts of the story that may not have been communicated before. So really that movement toward inclusion of the stories has then also rolled forward to inclusion of our audience, and NAI moved forward with opening up the definition and kind of really focusing, making sure that we made it clear that the focus is on those inclusive experiences and that we're aiming to deepen understanding and broaden perspectives. So we're not just aiming to keep people, like support something they already believe that they brought to our site. We're aiming to really shift perspectives and to help them understand it more deeply and really understand what they can do about it. So that's the inspire engagement piece. We really want to have people go on from there to not only have that aha moment, but to also then connect and really want to move forward with understanding the place and understanding the story. Will they come back again? Will they be a repeat visitor? Will they go and buy a book? Will they do something else that helps them learn more about the topic and learn more about what we're sharing with them? Okay, so hopefully these are making sense to everybody, the definition of interpretation. All right.
Doing good so far.
So I want to jump right into the principles. We're going to cover this first. We will take a couple breaks as we go through the morning, just to let everybody take care of their bio breaks. Something also very important as we work with our audiences is make sure everybody's comfortable. So we want to jump first right into the principles of interpretation. So this is coming again from Freeman Tilden, from that first work of kind of looking at this whole field and figuring out what is it that we're doing out here and how can we do it best and how can we train people in how to do it. So when we look at the principles of interpretation, Tilden's first principle was that any interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or experience of the visitor will be sterile. So I know that language sounds a little bit obtuse, but we really break these down in order to make them memorable for us. We usually break them down to one word each. And so here, the word we would want as a takeaway is relate. We want interpretation to relate. So let's think about how would we help something, how would we help our interpretation of a place to relate to something within the visitor? How could we help them connect to something within the visitor? So first off was getting to know our audience. Remember, we care about our audience. We want to hear what their perspectives are and what they're bringing to the presentation. So you might show up early and chit chat with your audience. You get to know them as they're showing up. You might have asked a few of those preparatory questions. You're getting to know where people are coming from. Is it their first time at the site? Are they new visitors? Are they somebody who's come for a different type of program and it's the first time coming for this type of program that you're offering today? So we're really getting to know something about them. You also could have some questions that you've embedded right there in your introduction as you're starting up your program and as you're getting things going. You're maybe asking, who's been here before? Has anybody ever been to the lime kilns? Have you seen an example of something like this? So you're kind of judging their familiarity. You're getting to know them in that very conversational way. So it's not awkward. We're not like quizzing our audience as they show up. We're keeping it very conversational. And we're just stashing away all those little tidbits of information that we get from our audience. Because as we work through our program, hopefully you've already planned in advance ways that you can make the content relatable. But you're also responding to any of that new information you've gotten from your audience. So as you're going through the program, you're remembering that, somebody mentioned they were there from the Southwest, and you're going to point out that connection to your site. So you're pulling all those different strands together. So we want to make it relatable. We also can help people relate by making the content something that they can understand. So if we think about things like really big numbers or really big information, kind of those fun facts about a place or about an object or a resource, we're kind of looking at those big ideas, but we're then trying to make them digestible and understandable in some way. So one example I love is in Gainesville, when I worked there, we did the Florida Black Bear curriculum. And we had one staff artist who made this wonderful banner for us, because that program was typically going out to libraries where it was 100 kids seated in a room. So you're taking this banner with you, and we could talk about the size of the Florida black bear and how it was so much smaller than every other bear, including regular black bears that you would have here in Maryland. So we talked about this subspecies being so much smaller, but to really help them get it, we had this great wow factor example where the banner would roll up and it went up to the full like 14 feet of a polar bear standing on its back legs. And then on top of it, she had the silhouettes of all the other species of bears until you got down to our wee little Florida black bear. So it really drove the point home that this was not a big and scary animal. This was a very special subspecies that we had there in Florida. So we had that kind of comparison, which helped people to really relate to it and understand it. Like, that's about as tall as my dad. That's about as tall as my mom. And here I am, the kid, and the Florida black bear is even smaller than I am. So it really helped them to relate. So you can use things like that. You can use simile, you can use metaphor, you can use those visual examples that are really helping somebody to get it. You also might be relating to their previous experience. So I might ask if when I was at sites where I was interpreting battle, or I was never interpreting a specific battle, but we were interpreting Reconstruction at our site in 1870 in Florida. And we were talking about the impacts of the Civil War. And so I might ask a group before I started that presentation, who here is a veteran? And that way I'm getting them relating to their own experience and thinking about their own experience, kind of pulling it to front of mind before I start talking about the impacts of this upon families and upon those who served. So we kind of have ways that we can draw upon somebody's past experience and bring it right up to front of mind by just crafting ahead of time and thinking of the right questions. So you're going to have questions that will really help you to get to the heart of the topic and help you really hone in and really get your audience kind of personally relating before you've even started the presentation. So just a handful of ideas for you there. For Tilden's second principle, he says, information as such is not interpretation. Interpretation is revelation based on information. And so for this one, the take-home word here is to reveal. We aim for our interpretation to reveal a bigger meaning, to reveal the story, to reveal the take-home message. And I love this picture because she's got her big old notebook. Is basically, you don't want to throw the book at your audience. We're not aiming to just prove that we know it all. Particularly with my plant people, it's not about just cramming in as many scientific names as you possibly can to prove how much you know. It's not about showing off what you know. It's all about understanding where your audience is coming from and then relating to them directly. So you're aiming to actually connect with them and connect with their previous experience. Remember that relatable piece. We want to keep that in mind, but we're also looking to reveal the bigger meaning. So what am I aiming to do here? I want to connect my audience so that they have that aha moment. That is the most powerful thing. Now, I will give you a caveat and a warning that once you get an audience to this point, like you've had somebody have that aha moment, or you've had somebody halfway through your program go, wow, they've really gotten it. It is addictive. So I will warn you of that. Like, this will be the thing that you are chasing as an interpreter and as a teacher even. Anytime we get somebody to have that enthusiasm, that wow, that aha moment, it really connects us to them in a very direct way. And it becomes something that you're chasing all the time. So you're going to try to get better and better and better at figuring out how to reveal the big picture, how to help people comprehend and understand their connection to that resource and to that story. So you're helping them to connect in that way. All right, Tilden's third principle is that interpretation is an art, which combines many arts, whether the materials presented are scientific or historical or architectural. Any art is to some degree teachable. Now, the first time I came across this, I thought, oh, it's an art. I'm not an artist. I can't get this. How do I put this all together? And really, we're looking at that last sentence, that any art is to some degree teachable. So that was kind of the relief valve, like, oh, okay, I can do this because it is something that I can learn. It is something that I can practice. And we find with any of our interpretation that you do get better at it over time. So there's an art to interpretation itself. There's many ways, though, that we could interpret this principle. So there's an art to how you speak. There's an art to how you read your audience. There's an art to how you're connecting with them, how you're designing that program, including those pieces that relate and reveal what we've covered so far, and we'll be getting into more. But there's an art to how you put all that together and how you understand your audience, and especially how you respond to those immediate things that you picked up on as you're asking questions, or when you even see somebody's face have that little like, oh, that wow of recognition. Every little detail like that, there's an art to how you apply your presentation with all of those different pieces. So you can look at that as an art of its own. We also look at how do we integrate art in interpretation. So art for art's sake, right? we're looking at how do we incorporate sensory experiences? How do we incorporate maybe sound or scent or taste? Maybe coloring, maybe some kind of hands-on art. Somebody's going to build a replica. They're going to learn a skill and make something during your program. That could be really a part that helps them to connect in a very direct way to the object or the artifact that you're sharing. So we also look at how art might be combined in how we're crafting the program and how we might use it in that context. And so I always try to think of the multi-sensory piece here as well. We know that we can connect with people much better the more senses we're incorporating in that whole process. All right, the fourth principle is that the chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. Now, provocation is one of those words that I think has changed over time. Like today, we tend to hear provocation and we think, okay, you're provoking someone, that's a bad thing. Or you're thinking, oh, it's provocative. Well, that's another connotation, but it isn't exactly what we're aiming for here. So the chief aim being not instruction, we're not aiming to teach our audience, but we want to move them to change and to create action. And so it's provocation to action. I want to provoke them. I want to tap into their curiosity. So we really look at this as provoking curiosity. How are we getting them interested and excited and wanting to come back and do it again, wanting to see the next thing, wanting to pursue further interest. So it's kind of related to that aha moment that we're looking to provoke them, but we also want to make them care so much that they want to do something about it. We're wanting to really connect and have impact with our interpretation. So we think of provoke in this different way, but this would be our take-home word for the fourth principle, that we're really thinking about how we're going to flip that switch, how we're going to get that audience wanting to come back and wanting to do something relevant to our site. Okay, the fifth principle is that interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part, and must address itself to the whole man rather than any phase. So right here in presenting that sentence, there's already two parts. There's already two interpretations of this. So for this principle, the word we use is holistic, that we want to think about interpretation being holistic. So we're both addressing the big picture and we're addressing the whole person. And I think this ties in a lot to the kind of interpretation we do today, where we're really thinking about our audience and responding to our audience and really engaging them in the conversation. So that's about addressing the whole person. They're going to come to your program bringing miles and miles and miles of baggage. So understand that everybody comes to your program bringing their entire personal past history, which means, they may have had a negative experience with something that you're going to present. They may have an object that they see that's going to be a trigger for them because they're bringing that whole past history with them. So we have to consider that carefully, but we also are, in getting to know our audience, we're looking for those clues and trying to find any piece of their background and their knowledge that we're able to connect into our program. So we're helping to engage that whole person. We're helping to understand where their personal history is going to get them connected to our resource. We're also thinking about the holistic perspective as far as our resource. So we're looking to focus on the whole. I gave you guys the example of interpretive planning that I did in Gainesville. And one of the things we decided was a goal when we looked at our mission goals and objectives. Something we decided was a goal for our interpretation there was that we wanted to always connect to the natural communities as kind of our framework for that programming. And that meant that, for example, if somebody came in to the Nature Center saying, "Where's the red-headed nuthatch? Where can I see it?" Then even though you're tempted when you've answered the same question a million times to be like, "Oh, showings are at 10 and 2, go here." Birds don't work that way. So unfortunately, we have to find them where they are. And what we would do then is help that birder to understand where that bird was going to be. So we would talk about, here on the map, this is our pine flatwoods, and here's our pine sandhills, and there's an ecotone here. This trail happens to run right along that ecotone, which is where those two communities come together. And that's the perfect place to see this bird. You're most likely to see them there. So having that way to relate it out to the bigger picture was helping us to use a holistic lens so that that birder left there not just having ticked that box that, yes, they saw that bird, but they left there actually understanding more about the natural communities we were protecting and why, because those were essential to this specific wildlife they were wanting to see. So we sometimes intentionally are really focusing on drawing something out to the whole. I also think taking a holistic perspective can help you. And I say this because we know that public speaking is one of the biggest fears in the United States. If people rate things they're fearful of, public speaking usually comes out right at the top of the list. So when we're looking at that fact, I want you to realize, and I'll mention a few different ways today, how in interpretation, usually our audience is there to hear what we have to say. They're there because they want to hear what you have to say. So that already helps to support you as the speaker and help you to feel more comfortable, is realizing that they're there, they're on your side. But also, if you aren't sure about something, if you really have a good understanding, a thorough understanding of the big picture, of the holistic perspective, you might get a very detailed question that you're uncomfortable with. And right now, this morning, I want to give you all the blessing to say that you are allowed to say, "I don't know." So I'm giving you permission to say, "I don't know." It is okay. It doesn't make you look dumb. It's not something you have to worry about. Going into your presentation, you don't have to be thinking like, "Oh, somebody's going to catch me on something I don't know." It's okay to say, "I don't know." Now, good customer service says, "I don't know, but let me find out for you." Okay. In the old school days, we used to actually carry postcards in our cargo pant pocket that we could let somebody fill out, and we would mail them back an answer. Now in the modern days, we can give them an email address, or we can get a ping on social media. We might even make a note on our phone that we have on us so that we're ready to get back to them. Or we might even invite them. This is a much more engaging experience, right? If I say, "Hey, I actually have that information. I know where it is in a field guide. As soon as we get back to the Nature Center, please join me. Come in and let's look it up. Let's learn together." So that really is a much more audience engaging way. You might not have that ability to answer the question. You might need to say, "Hey, I've got to ping somebody at the university who has that answer," but we want to get back to them. So having a big understanding of the big picture, a deep understanding of the holistic perspective, can also help you then to give them some context. So you might not be able to answer that highly specific question, but you can at least have the context to say, here's how that fits in this big picture. Here's how that fits in this ecosystem. Here's what we see when we're looking around this ecosystem. And here's how we're able to fit it in that context. And you still might need to go look up an answer for that very specific question, but you've at least given them that connection to the bigger picture. You've given them that holistic perspective. So just a couple different ways to interpret this word of holistic, that we're looking at both the person, everything they're bringing to the table, and we're looking at the resource itself. Okay, for Tilden's sixth principle, that interpretation addressed to children should not be a dilution of the presentation to adults, but should follow a fundamentally different approach. So what this means is I can't just take my wildflower walk that I've designed for adults, take out all the scientific names, and then we're good to go for first graders. It's just not going to work. So I really need a completely different approach. And there's lots of ways we can vary programs for specific ages. I often get the question, what do I do when it's just families? It's just a random group coming in. I don't know who it's going to be. Then I would say you want to really focus on the multisensory, multiple learning styles, kind of bringing all these different aspects into your program anyway, because they work with adults just as well as they do with children. So there are some components that are kind of a go-to. They're something that really helps us to craft the whole picture and really can help us address those different audiences. Also, one rule of thumb is that happy parents or happy kids equals happy parents. So if you've got the kids engaged and you've got families there, if the kids are engaged, the parents are going to be happy with the program. And often you'll find the parents will get so excited and so engaged that they're interrupting the kids to ask you their own questions. So we really can address multiple audiences pretty easily. It's just all about incorporating all these pieces we're talking about this morning, that we want to make sure we have ways to relate, we have ways to reveal, we have things that are going to provoke, and we're also connecting to who our audience is. So really quickly, you're going to get to know in a group, let's say we have a group of families, I'm going to know pretty quickly which one of those kids is kind of coming with an already loaded interest. If they're already the kid who's crazy about snakes and they're already jumping in to tell me their stories and to answer every question, then I'm going to capitalize on that by then bringing them into the presentation. And whenever there is a basic info about snakes I wanted to share, I'm going to tap that kid and have them participate and them act as a resource. So there's lots of ways we can incorporate our audience in engaging these different ages. So I just want to touch on a few really quick things. Obviously, you could have an entire class about how to teach different ages, looking at pedagogy, which is how to teach children, and andragogy, which is how to teach adults. But aside from that, I just want to do a really quick overview, kind of looking at all these different pieces. So if we're looking at preschool, actually our youngest audience might be toddlers, infants and toddlers. We do actually run some programs at the Nature Center for infants and toddlers, but they're much more experiential. It's actually focused a lot on the parents and getting the parents feeling that it's okay to take kids outside and it's okay to have them get their hands dirty, for an example that might work with our master gardeners. That it's okay for them to get outside and be experiencing things and to have them outside. And it's okay to put a stick in your mouth if you're at the age that you're still putting everything in your mouth, right? So we're also mainly training the parents at that age, but getting them comfortable with having their kids outside and getting them comfortable with those experiences. So the next tier would be preschool. And for preschool, we really are careful in how we design programs. There is a whole movement for forest preschools and nature preschools, which are all about child-guided and experiential processes. But there still is a ton of planning that happens behind that. We're still kind of determining, like, what are the goals for today? What are we focusing on? What do we want to have covered? And what kind of objectives can we write to meet those different goals that we want to meet? So with preschool, we're looking at maybe motor development, fine motor development, gross motor development, social skills. And even though it might be child directed when they're outdoors, the instructors are still watching for all of those pieces to happen. So they're watching for anything that's creating a social interaction, that's creating an ability for kids to relate to each other. And then they're really capitalizing on that. So they're using that to help the kids get to engage with each other, and maybe really encouraging them to continue that activity so that they're creating that engagement. So we know with preschoolers, if you're designing a program that maybe is going to be a one-off program, maybe an hour long, probably less if we're going with preschool. We ideally can't get them to sit still for an hour, but you're looking for movement. Movement is very engaging. There is one absolutely magic tool, and that is music. So what we have found, actually in every place that I've worked, but especially at the current Nature Center, because we've had an active nature preschool program, is that anytime music was brought in, so just an employee with a guitar who happened to be singing a song, she would do a welcome song with the kids every morning, and then maybe have something that was connected to whatever their subject was for the day. But that just immediately brought the whole group together. It immediately got everybody completely focused. So it really is a magic bullet when it comes to working with the preschoolers, and almost any age, because I do find that music is very engaging all the way up through adult audiences. I've used it a lot with living history because I find that it can make a historical person much more relatable to your audience. So your audience will be drawn in by the music and very interested and focused on how that's making them feel, because music also starts conjuring those emotional pieces, and it really can be super engaging. So as we move into elementary school, okay, there we really want to have something active involved. We want to have some of that kinesthetic learning happening. We want to have the kids moving. We might use activities. Everybody always mentions like Predator and Prey, which is a game from several of the curricula that are available for school age kids. And those kinds of things are used so much because they work so well. So it really is great to have something that can get them moving and get them physically engaged and physically connecting to your topic. You also might just be incorporating a hike before you do something that's more sit down and intensive and focused. So if you were going to, have kids helping with a gardening project per se, maybe you want to have them help haul and move all the compost and mulch first. I mean, yes, an elementary schooler can't lift a whole load in a wheelbarrow, but they can do a good bit. You'd be surprised at how strong they are. And that's going to help kind of take off the edge of the energy and kind of help them connect more and focus more as they're coming off of that very energetic activity. So for elementary, we're looking at things that are activities that are going to help them connect and engage, and how we're going to incorporate sensory aspects to help them connect and engage. Lots of different tools there. As we get into middle school and high school age, these can be kind of challenging audiences. And when I was working at the Estuary Center, I was one of the only people who liked the high school group. That was my preferred age to work with. So I pretty much always got all the high school groups. For middle schoolers, for instance, we gave them a real world scenario. So for the middle school programs, we had an example of this marina that's nearby wants to double in size. Here's all the ways that we think it could impact the area. And we're looking for your opinion. You're going to help us decide what the recommendations should be for whether to build and expand the marina or not. So we had them get a real world scenario and then go out there and research that and collect data on the ground. So they did water quality sampling. They did looking at water samples to look at the invertebrates, the microinvertebrates, do macroinvertebrate sampling. So they were kind of looking at all these measures that we would do scientifically of the natural resources to help then influence that decision. So giving them a real world scenario was very powerful in helping them connect to the topic and helping them to have a better understanding. As we get into high school, like not just those real world scenarios, but tools like debate can be very good. They can really get enthusiastic about playing the different parts in a debate scenario. So we're really engaging in their need to establish themselves amongst their peers, to connect to the content, but in a way that really makes them feel like they're having an impact. So we can use these different tools to kind of bring it up to the real world meaning. Something I also really loved with those high school groups is the power of suggestion. And I think this works with all ages, but it seemed to be particularly strong with our high school group. So we did a canoe trip that would go out and through the marsh loop along our canoe trail. And at the very beginning, I had to do paddle instruction. I had to, kind of explain what the goal was of the whole trip, like what we were going to see, all those ecosystem things. And then I would set out at the beginning, and a lot of times I was in a kayak just because it was a little more maneuverable, or I might have another canoe, but I was ahead of the group, and I would wait until we got across the main body of water so that I could see that my group was starting to be able to paddle and stay in a group, stay in a clump at least, if not a line. We usually had a paddle volunteer bring up the back to make sure everybody stayed together. But what I would start doing, and I never said anything about trash cleanup. So I had introduced paddling, I had introduced the ecosystems we were going to see and why they were important. But then as we started paddling and I saw my group was managing to paddle well, I would just start silently cruising 5 feet this way and pick up a piece of trash. Cruise 8 feet this way and pick up a piece of trash. And by the time we got to the second stop, pretty much every canoe had multiple pieces of trash in it. I never told them they were picking up trash, and I never directed them to do that. It was simply that they were following my example. And so just not even saying a thing, lead by action, can actually create this bigger impact. So lots of different tools for how we look at different ages. When we get into adults, for adults, we know that we need to connect their learning to something that they already know. It is very critical for adults to have kind of that string of pearls approach. We want to pull up something that you know already. I'm sure a lot of you came to this presentation this morning knowing about public speaking. Maybe it's something you've avoided forever, and maybe it's something you've embraced and it's a part of your work. So you're coming to this presentation with kind of that background, and I hope we're expanding upon that and helping you to see some new perspectives and new ways that this could be done. So with adults, we're really wanting to connect back to some previous experience. So that's where, as I'm starting a presentation, I might be using a lot of those self-referencing questions. I might be asking, who's been here before? Who's enjoyed this? Who's ever paddled before? Have you ever been in a boat with somebody else? Have you ever tandem paddled? Because that's an entirely different thing. So we're looking at how we connect the current experience to their previous experience. That's very important when we're working with our adults. And throughout this whole process, no matter what age, I really want to emphasize that you want to think about your audience and you want to be connecting to them. So you're looking for how they're engaging, you're looking for their interest, and you're playing off of that. You're bouncing off of that the whole time you're presenting. Okay, I just want to add a couple more principles that come from Cable and Beck. So they wrote a book that was Interpretation for the 21st Century, and they were adding on some kind of expanding on Tilden's principles. They wrote 15 principles, but there's a few I want to point out just because they are pretty important as add-ons. I'm just going to scooch out of the sun a little bit. So they're very important as add-ons because they're some other areas we need to focus on. So one of the things they added was that high technology can reveal the world in exciting new ways if it's done with foresight and care. So we really want to think about how technology is used when we're using it for programs. It might be a great tool. I'm sure all of you have probably been to an exhibit somewhere where something was broken. So they had cool interactives that were digital interactives, or even buttons and hands-on manipulative interactives. And typically something is going to be broken. And that's because it's very hard to keep up with the maintenance of those kinds of things once you have them out there. So they could be a really cool toy, but I would caution you that we also don't want to let the gadget take over for the interpretation. So we don't want the cool toy, the gadget, to mean more than the content of the program itself. We want the content of the program to stand alone. So we're really wanting to use it with caution when we include technology. Now, I think technology has also evolved since the time when they wrote this, because now almost everybody's going to have this microcomputer in their pocket, right? And they have a computer that actually has apps that might be supporting your program. So you might be teaching how to use iNaturalist or eBird, They might be actually looking something up during your program. A lot of us, you might have the impulse to think that if somebody's on their phone while you're talking at them, that they're chatting with somebody else and doing something completely not relevant to your program. But in many cases, they're maybe taking notes, or they're writing down a question they don't want to forget, or they're actually pulling up an app and looking up another thing that they saw that maybe they don't want to interrupt the whole group to ask. So there's a lot of ways that technology is being used today that can be expanded upon and even more. And you could actually plan ahead to incorporate those in your program so that they're serving the purpose of the interpretation and of the program rather than distracting. Another one Cable and Beck added that I think is very important is that the overall interpretive program must be capable of attracting support. So what this means is not just the support you might think of, which is money. It's always important that your programs are able to be self-sustaining, that we're able to fund them. So whether that money is people paying a fee to get in, or if that money is somebody else paying the fee on behalf of a group, maybe a sponsorship. But this goes beyond just the money part. It's also public support. And we know that in our organizations, when the budgets get really tight, when it's a bad budget year, one of the first things that tends to get cut is the service pieces. So things like the education and interpretation department are likely to get hit hard. So it is very important that any programs we're offering are actually helping support the mission of the organization, but also are doing such a good job of doing that, that they have support from the community. So your community should be the ones who are speaking up and saying, we want this to happen. We want these programs here. We want this being offered. And so that support is both the monetary support and the sort of social support for a program. We want to make sure that the interpretation is doing such a good job that it's connecting with that and it's gaining that support. With Master Gardeners in particular, you guys are an entirely volunteer workforce, right? You're out there doing volunteer work, you're doing your hours every year, but you're probably doing that at a place that you care about and at a place where you want to see them meet their mission. And so it's very critical that you are doing that in the best way possible, which is why Stephanie's wanting you to add this skill set so that you can go out and share the message in the best way possible to really connect with your audience and gain support for those places. And that last piece is that passion is the essential ingredient. Passion has to be there. So as I said, you guys are probably volunteering at places that you actually care about. That's a good thing, because the one thing you can't fake for an audience is that you care. If you have no interest in the subject, if you are just there to kill an hour, I don't know why you would volunteer to step up and give a presentation if you really didn't care, but it has to be there. That's the thing you can't fake. And even if you couldn't use any of the other tools I'm sharing with you this morning, if you are passionate about your subject, it shows and your audience can tell. So that is the one thing that must be there. And that is the you piece we'll get back to later. All right. So I think it is a good time for us to take just about a 5-minute break. Does that sound good to you, Stephanie?
Yep, that sounds great. And then we also had just one question that I wanted to do before we go into our break. Someone had asked if they can use this event towards hours for NAI recertification.
That I don't know. I can ask NAI.
Okay.
It probably would, except that we also are just covering kind of a smaller basic piece.
Sure.
Of what's incorporated in that larger training. So
no problem. We can follow up on that.
Okay.
Okay, great. Perfect. So what do you want to do, like 10 minutes?
Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
All right, folks. So it's 10 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we'll see everyone back at 10:10.
Okay. Just going to temporarily stop the screen share.
Yep, sounds good.
And
All right, folks, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and continue with our presentation. Hope everyone had a nice break. And Angela, I did just want to give you a heads up. There's been a lot of great comments that have been sent just to me about how much people are learning and how really eye-opening this is. So thank you so much again for being here.
Oh, good. I do see somebody asked in the chat, can I see the audience? And the problem is I can't.
Yeah.
It's always interesting, talking at a blank screen, or when Stephanie and Gina both turn themselves off, I just have their still photo and that's it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
I'm trying to make eye contact with my invisible people. Yeah, I think some really interesting questions there. So I'm actually going to start back before starting the screen share. Just start back because I want to keep it where I can see the chat.
Okay.
Because I want to do a quick activity.
Perfect.
And there's one really long one here.
Yeah, they were just saying how there's a different language and approach to interpretation, and they had gone to a garden to get a tour, and the tour was completely different more recently than it had been in the past, and they used different language and talked about the people who had originally done a lot of the work in the garden. So I think that's really cool to see.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick exercise with you guys. Obviously, we're not hands-on in person, so we're going to make this work using the chat. So I'm going to ask everybody to be hot on their chat keyboard.
Perfect.
And I'd like to show you an object. And as I show you the object, just imagine we're passing it around. And I will show it to you in detail on the camera. And I'd like you to put in the chat the first word that comes to mind, the first thing that pops into your head as if you were holding this object and having it passed around. Okay? All right. So here's the object. I love that we got gumbo already. Okay, so I think maybe we've gotten about everybody. All right. So clearly you guys can tell that it's a spoon. You can tell that it's wood. I'm seeing, some questions. All right. So normally you would get to have your hands on it, so you could actually immediately get words like smooth or brown, those kinds of words. So I'd like to tell you a story. As I said, I worked for City of Gainesville Nature Operations for 10 years. And there in Gainesville Nature Parks, we did an equal part of natural resource interpretation, talking about our nature, talking about our nature parks. We had 10,000 acres at the time, 10,000 acres of conservation land within the city limits. So it was a pretty special place. And then we also had the Living History Farm, which through the process of my interpretive planning, we actually honed that down and made it an 1870 Living History Farm. So we really focused the interpretation there on a specific time frame, looking at Reconstruction, post-Civil War. And we did a very intentional living history programming at that site. And we used a my time, your time approach, which was because the site was so small that we didn't have a huge orientation center, so that people weren't sure what they were walking into. They had signage, and as they came in and they started meeting people from the past, the signage had the orientation, but we might occasionally get questions who were really out of the box and that we had to address. So in that context of working those living history weekends, usually my task first thing in the morning was to light up the wood stove in the cabin and start getting biscuits prepared. So I would make biscuits and make fresh butter each weekend. And we were doing the biscuits and butter so that our visitors could sample, have a sample of a biscuit, try out some fresh butter, obviously tapping on your ag education there that our master gardeners also might get into. But it was because we wanted them to be able to taste the cane syrup. And the cane syrup was something we made on site. We grew the sugar cane, we did the cane press, and our cane boil was an annual event there at the site. So when we were creating that cane syrup, it was something we kept throughout the year, and we wanted visitors to be able to try it. So we would first thing start up, make the biscuits, have that ready for the visitors throughout the day. And then the next thing I would start doing is making lunch. And that cooking was actually a part of the interpretation on the site, because you would be amazed how many people came through who didn't know chicken came with bones in it, or that vegetables had to be taken apart and cleaned before you could prepare them. So we really opened the eyes of a lot of people who, in some of their words, said, "Oh, I always just ate food that came from boxes." So that connecting with where your food comes from really ends up being an undercurrent in a lot of other historic interpretation.
That's awesome.
So that was just part of that process was preparing lunch. And that lunch was typically to feed our staff and volunteers who were working the program that day or that weekend. So we would sit down and have kind of a family meal with the historic family that was there on site. And we would still be talking to visitors as they came through during that and playing our roles within that historical family. So that became part of our process. And I noticed one of my coworkers, George, no matter what I made, so I was always making historical recipes or receipts as they're called, no matter what I made, George liked it. It didn't matter if I thought, this historic recipe is like really not that great. it didn't matter. He liked it. And so I noticed this trend, and obviously I was cooking for staff on the weekends and volunteers, but throughout the week, the rest of the week, I noticed that every day he brought white bread and bologna. Every single day. And so I started noticing that, and being someone who cooks too much at home too, I just got in the habit of bringing an extra container of leftovers of whatever I'd made that I was going to have for lunch. I just started bringing extra, and we got in this habit of having lunch every day. And usually it was whatever recipe I tried at home, which also was not always great. But no matter what, George liked it. And so I felt like this is a very self-gratifying thing on my part. You know, we have this routine, we have lunch every day, but here's this guy who likes anything I make, regardless of how I think it turned out. And I thought, well, at least he's eating something then other than white bread and bologna. So hopefully getting some more nutrients and vegetables and all kinds of good stuff. So we just kind of fell into this routine. And we had that process of working living history weekends. We usually would do that meal, and then in the afternoon go out onto the front porch and maybe pick the seeds out of cotton or card the wool or whatever task needed to be done. I'd usually be sitting out on the corner of the porch, and we had shade roof on the front porch, but we also had this beautiful cherry tree that would shade the front corner of the porch. And so we all loved that tree. Well, a few years had gone on, and then we had one year that we had 3 hurricanes in a row come across North Central Florida. So one after the other, it caused a lot of damage. All of our park staff, those of us who were on the burn team, were pulled out to help with roads and getting trees cleared, getting down trees cleared. And it was a huge job. It was really a bonding experience for staff to do that kind of heavy physical labor side by side every day until you're literally exhausted. And it took us a long time before we got back into our own parks. We were having somebody climb their way in to feed the animals twice a day down at the farm, but it took us a while before we actually got down there and started clearing that area. And when we did our best to recycle and reuse everything we found. So all of our big heart pine that had come down was set aside for the guy who did split rail demonstrations. And all of the red oak was harvested and set aside for, either the blacksmith shop or for my wood stove in the cabin. So we really tried to capture all of that and have it ready to use again. But we noticed that we had lost our cherry tree in front of the cabin. And we were all kind of sad about that, but we went forward and made the decision to plant a grandfather's beard, Chiananthus that is a lovely native, but also was typical of old home sites in Florida. So it was a good fit for that space. And we planted that to replace the tree. I knew that we'd have shade again one day, but shade in Florida in August is a pretty important thing and something you really value and treasure. So we went on after all this work and all this cleanup and kind of getting back into the routine of getting programs going and getting back to living history weekends. And shortly after that, my husband took a job here in Maryland. And so I always say I chose the man I loved over the land I loved. So when I left Maryland and left Florida and came here to the great cold north, saw snow for the first time. Seen it many times since, but coming here was really leaving a place that I had been for 10 years and a place where the kind of work that we do in the community, people know you, people recognize you. Like you can't go to the grocery store without kids running up and asking about your snake. So it's part of what we do, and we really have that community engagement. So it was hard to leave, and we had a few different staff get-togethers for going away send-offs, and one of the staff who was an artist did this beautiful sketch of my favorite rooster and tucked one of his tail feathers in the frame. Mm. And at that same going away, George brought me this spoon. And he said, I'd like you to know I've carved this over the last several living history weekends from the wood of the cherry tree that we all loved that stood in front of the cabin. And I want you to know that it represents not only many meals shared together, the development of an excellent friendship, but it also represents you never letting me go hungry. Mm. And so I'd like you to use the chat again. And again, pretend we're passing this around. And now I'd like you to put in the first word that comes to mind when you look at this object. Okay, looks like it's slowing down, so maybe we got everybody. All right, so I'd like you guys to think about the first set of words you sent in. So remember, we had things like spoon, smooth. We had some inferences like gumbo spoon, which I love having a Creole grandma. Gumbo is a part of our family. So think about that first list of words. What was the same about that first list of words? What did they have in common? That first set of things you thought about. Yeah, they were objects. They were about the object, so descriptive.
Yeah, they're like physical descriptors.
Yeah, people are saying facts rather than emotion, utilitarian, what you can see and describe. Mm-hmm. So in interpretation, we call those tangibles. Mm. Okay, so tangibles, that's tangible, right? You can touch it, you can describe it. I could tell you the scientific name, whatever that info, right? That intellectual piece. So those are what we call the tangibles. Now think about the second set of words you gave me. What did those have in common? They were emotional. Okay, they had connection. Good. And so those were the heart words, right? They were the intangibles. Somebody just landed on it. So in interpretation, we call those intangibles. So we have the tangible, like I can touch it and describe it, but then we have the intangible. And something like this, like a wooden spoon, how does this have intangibles? What was the piece that got you from the first list, the tangibles, to the second list, the intangibles. Getting the story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you guys have landed right on it. It's the story that bridges the two. It's the story that's connecting those tangible pieces to the intangible pieces. And the story is the part we do as interpreters. So people might see just an object, but it's our task as interpreters to tell the story, to share the story of that object, share the meaning inherent to the resource, and connect it to the interests of our audience. Now, I cheated here. I used a trick on you because a lot of those things on your second list were things that I knew you could relate to simply because you're human. And so beyond intangibles in interpretation, we look at those words. What are those things that connect to people no matter where they come from, no matter what their life experiences is? Anybody have ideas? What were some of those things that everybody can connect to no matter what?
Food.
Food, right? Right up there at the beginning, even while I was telling the story, somebody said, "You're making me hungry."
Yes.
Okay, food. Okay, so I'll give you the cheater list: food, water, shelter, safety, fresh air. Maybe fresh air, we don't hear as much, or we don't feel as much as an intangible. But any of those basic needs for life and survival, those are going to connect across any audience. And then you guys also pointed out friendship. Okay, friendship, love, connection, belonging. I certainly hope those are universal across everybody, no matter where they come from. And so in interpretation, we go beyond saying the intangibles, which is all of those heart pieces that connect the story, helps us connect to those. We also have a subset of those intangibles that we call universals. And those universals are those things that everybody can relate to no matter what. So when I say I cheated and I used something, I didn't have to get to know you guys first to know that you could connect to food. And you could connect to the idea of feeding someone. That was a universal. Okay, so anytime you're crafting a program, I want you to be thinking about what are your tangibles? What are the physical characteristics? Because I would guess you're approaching a lot of presentations saying, I need to communicate to people like what order these vegetables need to be grown because this is the dates that they have to be in on time. And here's when you need to start your seeds. And here's the calendar. And we're going to go through all these details. There's a lot of details. I actually, this last year, my mom looped back and decided she was going to put up some square foot gardens. And I have a pretty big square foot garden set in the backyard that's been going for a couple years. And she decided she was going to add some. And she was like, well, can you mail me seeds? And I said, well, you're in Florida, so I can send you seeds, but you should have started them 2 months ago. I'm up here where it's cold. You should have been way ahead of me. So she did get a late start on some stuff, and now she's got, spinach and things that can handle it being cooler. But it was interesting. She was asking me all these questions, and I ended up sharing with her my garden spreadsheet because I went out there and collected all the data, plugged it all into a massive Google sheet. And I've got that so that I can have it on my phone. I can look up a date when something needs to be checked or when I need to put the next set of seeds in. Mm-hmm. I have all my seeds filed by date. So, nice. And it has to be adaptable though, right? You have to keep changing that. It's not one size fits all. There's things I planted this year that I was like, I got to go put a note because this was wrong. Mm-hmm. This just totally didn't work. And it might have only not worked that way this year. It might be different next year. Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at all that, I sent her this huge spreadsheet and she looked at it and she said, well, that's just completely overwhelming. She said, Granny never had a spreadsheet. And I said, right, but Granny didn't have a full-time job. Her full-time job was watching the garden, planting the garden, tending that. That was a primary chunk, one of her primary duties. So yeah, she could just have this all memorized, internalized, but I'm busy. I have lots of things to distract me. So it has to be on a spreadsheet and those dates have to be on my calendar and they have to ping me with reminders or else I'm going to miss it in the chaos of everything else.
Yes.
Especially now that we're, back to commuting
Yes.
and not getting that extra time. So, when we think about all those facts, and I would guess that you're probably designing programs where you're saying, I've got to communicate this huge amount of data. There's a huge amount of facts that need to be communicated. But how can you then bridge the story that's going to help people feel it and care about it? Because they're not going to care until you touch their heart. You have to find a way that's going to help them connect. And I would say with master gardening programs, particularly if you're getting into food gardening, you've got some easy cheaters there. You've got a bunch of universals, right? Because we mentioned food. Okay, food's important. People like eating. You might even mention some seasonal foods that people are going to have a much stronger relationship to. I'm always shocked at how many people buy a ton of pumpkins, pile them on their porch, and then let them rot. Because I'm the one who goes to the neighbors and I'm like, are you going to eat that? I want to eat that.
That's wonderful.
So, please give it to me just before it rots, because I'm going to eat it. And then the rest is going in my compost because that's valuable. Don't put it in the trash. So you've got some great universals already built in when we talk about food, when we talk about shelter. When we look at native plants, we try to help people relate to that idea of shelter, of homes. You're planting homes for wildlife. You're planting plants that will raise baby caterpillars, and without baby caterpillars, we don't have baby birds. So if we want to feed baby birds, we have to have lots of caterpillars. So we're talking about homes. We're talking about these bigger picture things that are more than just planting dates. It's more than just the data. So you want to find ways that you're having a story that helps people relate. And particularly with kind of your master gardener audiences, you probably also have ringers in your audience. So I would guess that most times that you're doing a program, even if it was a gardening program for kids, you can ask right up front, like, who's ever grown something before? And sure, they might have only grown one little seed in a pot with grandma. But if they start relating that story, which kids, anytime you ask them to give you questions, it's going to turn into stories. Well, one time my dad, he saw. So
true.
As soon as you start getting that story, then you want to connect. So that story can then help you to jump off from that and say, hey, just like that sunflower you planted with your grandpa in a pot, we're going to now look at how we can grow a whole field of sunflowers, or a whole garden of food, and look at that diversity and talk about all the other living things it's supporting. So you're really able to expand beyond that, but also draw on their experience. So they might have no planting experience. Maybe they've never grown anything. And maybe they've only had, books that they were read in preschool that talk about, an acorn becoming a tree, and they just don't know how that works. So you're connecting to what their level of experience is, finding out where they have that in. And particularly with growing things, I think we have some incredible opportunities for those multi-generational experiences. In museums, I loved having that happen, where we'd be giving a tour and then, grandpa happens to be along with them and he's like, oh, I had that kind of telephone, or that kind of telephone was going out when I was a kid because my grandparents had that telephone or my parents did. So you so often have these wonderful, like, multi-generational connections. You're helping that family to connect to each other. And that connection to each other is also based around your resource. And so anytime you're finding those pieces that you can capitalize on, you can kind of spin that and turn that into a piece of your program where you're relating back to your experience. You just hear that offhand comment and you're like, hey, can you share that with the group? Can you tell us, what do you remember about this? Why were you planting loofah sponges amongst your squash? Why did grandma do that? What was that for? So you start to get those relational pieces. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So I hope you're getting that idea of tangibles and intangibles. And like I said, the universals are kind of the go-to because they're the easiest ones, but you can have a lot of really valuable intangibles that might be very specific to the resource or to the story that you've told. So, a lot of times people will say George on the list. So they might remember his name just because that was that very specific story. And, having those other connections can then let you help to figure out how you want to craft that story. So you can go either way. You might have a strong story you want to start with. You might be reaching out to your audiences to supplement that story. You might be drawing on their experience to help you supplement what you're sharing. But you also could be planning this in advance. I could be taking an object or an item or a plant and saying, what are my tangibles? So I'm kind of brainstorming myself. What are the tangibles here? What are the intangibles? And then how can I connect them? What is the story? What is the thing I'm going to share that's going to help people connect these two together? Okay.
Awesome.
All right. So I just wanted to give you that as we kind of start to jump in and look at our audience needs, and then moving on through the rest of our bullets for interpretation. So I'm going to go back to a share screen. Okay, are we up at full size?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so my to list was just a reminder to get our, our tangibles and intangibles lists. All right, so we've looked at those two pieces, and we know that in interpretation, we're looking for the story that's going to help us bridge between the two. Now we know we're playing off of our audience. I want you to think a minute about the kinds of audiences we get for our programs. And you might have to think outside of presentations you've necessarily done with master gardeners, but similarly, I think some of you, I know there's been wonderful tours and programs given here in Durwood at the demonstration garden that master gardeners have. I will let any of you who've worked on that project know that the abundance of flowers and pollinators buzzing around was actually an inspiration for how we're revamping our pollinator garden at the Nature Center, because we want to have that kind of year-round color and have things happening there all the time so that it's just exciting for visitors whenever they happen to arrive. But I know we've had some wonderful programs that happened over with those demonstration gardens as well. So think about who's dropping in there, who's showing up. For the most part, as I said, our audience wants to be with us. So we have two kinds of audiences. We would call them captive, like they have to be there. So is this a lecture or something that's happening? Maybe a school group, like sure, not every kid decided to be there, or they decided that if it's a field trip, this means it's a party for a day, and it isn't necessarily the emotional objectives that or the intellectual objectives that their teacher wants them to get out of the day, because they've looked at the curriculum that you said you would cover, and that's what they're hoping for their group to get out of it. So sometimes we have a captive audience, they have to be there, versus a non-captive audience, which is they want to be there. So most often in the interpretive field, we're dealing more often with a non-captive audience. We're dealing not only with non-captive in that they chose to be there, but also non-captive in that they walked in and you might have a very limited amount of time. They might not actually be there for an official program. We might be doing what we call informal interpretation or spontaneous interpretation, where somebody asks a question and instead of just giving that answer, like if somebody asks a question, very often we'll get questions like, what is this? What is that? What's that tree? And if you just say, oh, that's a tulip tree, well, that just shut down the entire conversation. That was an open, a closed, done. Instead, a lot of times people might be asking that because they're really curious to know more, but they don't know how to ask for more. And so they might ask you, hey, what's this tree? But they're really curious to get to know the place. Kind of as somebody was saying with tours, like where tours change to where they're incorporating a whole context. So I might answer like, oh, well, this one, if you look at the flowers, those flowers tell us that it's a tulip tree. And here, let's look at the other characteristics that give that away. And by the way, right here beside it, we have this other tree that we can compare. So we're looking at a black walnut, and we're looking at the slippery elm. We're looking at these different things that are close by. So we're then looking at the context and helping people to connect that idea of where these are. Remember back to that holistic, giving them the whole picture. So we're pulling together all these different ideas. One thing I just want to touch on really quickly is Maslow's hierarchy. If any of you have come from an education background, you've probably seen this before. But Maslow was a psychologist who really broke down what were the basic needs for humans. Now, I know we talked about food, water, shelter, safety. That's a different set. This is psychological needs. What do you as a human have to have? And that base need is this physiologic needs. So that's those things that we talked about a couple minutes ago, that, that food, water, shelter, those have to be met. And then the next thing up is safety. You have to feel like you're safe. Like the saber-toothed tiger is not chasing you right now. But if I don't deal with those things, I can't meet my audience somewhere else, because normally what I'm presenting in an interpretive program is things that are about love and belonging, esteem. I'm probably not going to get to self-actualization in a program. That's like reaching enlightenment. And that would be incredible if I could do that as an interpreter in a program, but it's probably not going to happen. There might be those tiny seconds, those magic moments where somebody says, wow. And that might be the magic moment that kind of jumps up here into our blue zone, right? When we're doing a full moon kayak trip and we turn the corner and there's the full moon hanging over the water. Like that could be one of those wow moments. So a lot of times our resource is helping to provide us with these incredible magic moments. But we, as the interpreter, also have to know how to shut up and get out of the way. So when the resource is giving us a wow moment, it is not the time to keep talking. It is the time to let people just experience, to have that moment. Even if it's not full self-actualization, they're still getting a little glimpse, a glimmer of that magic. So I'm usually trying to communicate to people at these higher levels. Okay, I want to help them with cognitive things, learning, understanding, having a sense of connection. All of those things are at a higher level, which means that I need to take care of the bottom stuff first. Okay, so we want to think about how we're dealing with some of those issues. Generally, right in my introduction, I'm going to introduce myself and my organization. So as I told you this morning, I was Angela Yau and a manager for Locust Grove Nature Center. So that's self and organization. But if we were in person, I'd be also giving you these pieces that are going to take care of your physiologic and safety needs. So I'd be giving you, for example, the restroom is right down the hall. The water fountain is located nearby. We're going to take a restroom break right now, and then we're going to hit the trail. We're going for about an hour hike. We'll be returning here to the visitor center to where the restrooms are. Okay, what did I just do with that? Now, I probably would also add that our hike is on relatively even terrain. It's a nice cool day today, so we don't really have to worry about sun or bugs. So I might take care of some of those things too. When you do a quick little intro like that, what I've done is remove you being concerned about where the bathroom is. Okay, you're not thinking the whole time like, I've got to pee, when's she going to let me pee? We're taking care of it. I'm saying, let's do that now. And we're going to get back here in an hour. So it's an hour until the next time you will see this restroom. I also took care of a safety need because you know that we're going to go hike a trail and I'm bringing you back to the visitor center. I'm not going to leave you out in the woods somewhere. You know that we're coming back here so that we're able to close that loop. You know that you're going to come back. You're going to come back to where your car is, where your bathroom is, all those things you might need. I also tried to address some other safety needs. So if it was particularly hot, sunny day, we're going to make sure you have a sun hat. I'm going to make sure you have bug spray. But I took care of a few of those things and telling you the conditions of the trail. So that's just like the basic stuff we want to get out of the way before we head out on our trip. So, I might be taking care of getting you food and water, making sure you have restrooms. I might be taking care of, our group here on the left is looking like they're going to be pretty parched out there in the desert with the sun blazing, no hats, no anything. Okay, there might be some wow factors. There might be things that we want to test your safety a little bit, but I'm going to give my group a heads up and make sure that that can be done in a safe manner, even if they feel a sense of surprise. We also might be thinking about love and belonging, like how are you a part of the group before I can get to knowledge and understanding. So some tricks we use for that is, especially in the context of a longer program, like I might have everybody have name tags so that I can say like, hey, Stephanie, thanks for joining us today. Or Christina, I'm glad you had an answer for that. Or I see you're interested in the birds up there. So I'm referencing people, that also helps to create that sense of standing out within the group, which for Americans we like. That isn't true across all cultures, so you do want to know your cultural context. But being pointed out within a group, being recognized, or being a part of the whole group. So I might start addressing my whole group together or giving them some kind of shared experience as we're moving along our program. So for the gardening context, the shared experience might be everybody get a shovel full of manure as we move it to the compost pile. So we're going to have something that kind of gets everybody on the same page and feeling that group cohesion. Then we're ultimately trying to get to our knowledge and understanding. So we're trying to meet people in this space where they're able to learn and they're able to make those emotional connections, but they can't do that if they're preoccupied with those base needs. So that's the idea with using NASLO, is we try to focus on taking care of those base needs, getting that all out of the way so that our audience can actually be there, be present, and be hearing what we're trying to communicate. So that's all a piece of the same package. And I love this proverb that says, I hear and I forget. I see and hear, I remember. I see, hear, and do, I understand. I also love the one by Baba Duem that says, ultimately, you will conserve only what you love. So those ideas is that it's how you're engaging your audience in the program and in the education that's actually going to help it stick, that's helping them walk away with the idea and to walk away with that context kind of internalized. We also want to think about what we're trying to achieve with our programs. Okay, we're generally not trying to do interpropaganda. Okay, we're not out there to promote a particular viewpoint. We're avoiding interpretainment, that it's just about entertaining. It's actually deeper than that. We actually want to aim on interpretation, which is connecting those pieces. So what is interpropaganda? That's when we're ignoring multiple points of view. We might be oversimplifying a topic, and we're not allowing the audience to have personal perspective. So as I said, as we've expanded the definition of interpretation, we're really focusing to help people understand that the audience is central. We want to be inclusive. We want to be inclusive of all stories and of all members of our audience, that we're helping them move from their place of understanding, possibly into a new place of understanding. But it has to be done with baby steps. Okay, it takes a little bit at a time. We also want to avoid that one-way communication. So this is kind of that idea of having dialogue with our audience. We want to be able to communicate back and forth. It's a communication process. So remember, we use that term process instead of it just being a one-way thing. The other term I love from another fellow trainer is you don't want to fact vomit on your audience. That's rude. So it's not about spouting off all the facts. It's not about showing how much you know. You need to let go of your ego in order to be an excellent interpreter, to be able to meet your audience and to respond to their needs. Okay, we're also avoiding interpretainment. We don't want to use stereotypes. We don't want to arrange our facts to meet a punchline. We don't want to pretend our audience has no interest in the resource at all, or ignore what they think, not care what they think. So we want to be careful about how we're avoiding all of these things in doing authentic and good interpretation. We also want to think about why our audience is there. Okay, so we said we had to get rid of the base needs. They're mostly there by choice, right? And we want to provide outstanding interpretation. So we're avoiding preaching, we're avoiding interpropaganda and interpretainment, but we want to think about why the audience is here. And I said that using universals was kind of a cheater technique because I know those are going to connect no matter who my audience is. But if I think more deeply about the kinds of audiences that might be coming, this can help me to really understand their motivation, which then helps me understand what they're looking for. What are those interests they're bringing to the program? So we have different types of audiences that research has classified for us. So we have the explorers. These are people who are out there, looking to have an experience. They're just, after that experience, they want to have something that's unique and different. They want something exciting today. We also have facilitators. Those are those people who are helping somebody else have an experience. A lot of times this is parents bringing children to a site. So they might be coming because their child is super interested in your subject for your program or for your site, or they might be coming just because this is a good thing to expose their kids to. So they're facilitating that experience, they're bringing that group, and they're helping them to engage. Sometimes they'll be more active facilitating than others. Sometimes it's just they're bringing them to those places. You also have professionals and hobbyists. So this would be like your birders who are showing up, or master gardeners. You may be giving a presentation and you have fellow master gardeners in the audience, or you have somebody who never did master gardener, but they have a PhD in botany. So you might have some of those people who are either a professional in the field or they're a strong hobbyist. They have a strong interest. Or they might even have a hobby that's just tangential, but if you're able to figure out what that is, you can really tap that audience member to be on your side and to be helping you answer questions that might be out of your range of knowledge. So I'm going to be visually identifying, if I can, anybody who's hitting these categories. Some easy clues is like, as opposed to having regular binoculars around your neck, somebody who has that retractable binocular harness is going to be a clue, a giveaway that it's somebody who's like a much more serious birder, that I'm able to tap into that knowledge and know that as we're doing our wildflower walk, if a bird is interrupting us, I've got somebody in the group who can probably answer any of those questions if I don't want to detract from the plants that we're focusing on. So we also have experience seekers. These are those people who are out there kind of looking for those experiences, looking for maybe something really exciting. So this might be somebody wanting zip lining or wanting whitewater rafting or something that's kind of a really, really exciting experience. And then the rechargers. So that's people who are coming to nature for the sense of peace and the ways that it can help us to rejuvenate. It actually, a lot of research is now telling us how important it is to be in nature. I think a lot of people over the last 2 years have discovered the importance of green spaces. They've discovered how helpful it is to just get outside. There's research that even shows as much difference as a hospital where they saw that recovery times were almost twice as fast on the side of the building where the windows overlooked green grass. It wasn't even like a natural wooded area, just grass versus a parking lot. So on the side of the hospital that had views with grass, the recovery time was much faster. So it literally has like a physiologic impact on us to be outdoors and to be outside. And I know that all of you as master gardeners know this in your souls, because you understand that having your hands in the dirt, your hands in the soil is just so rejuvenating and so fulfilling. So that recharger is somebody who's going out there seeking that kind of just time outside. They want to hike, or they want to meditate, or they want to just have a quiet place to sit and enjoy and absorb. So all these different motivations for why somebody might be coming to our parks that are things we want to think about when we're looking at our audiences. So just visually reading clues, I just want to flip through a few pictures just to give us a kind of fun exercise. What kind of clues do you guys see here? And you can put those in the chat for me. Okay, hiking gear. We think we've got some experience seekers. Okay, they probably have a decent deal of experience. We see they have really nice gear. And their gear seems to be kind of worn in. It's not like they just went to REI and had a really good salesperson who sold them all the most expensive stuff. Okay, so they look prepared. This is probably a group that they might be asking questions about the trail or asking questions about the experience, or they might be coming into a program, but they don't look like they're ready to sit down for an hour-long campfire program, right? They look like they're ready to go. They're here maybe for the hike program or something that's going to get them out there. Okay, do you see any clues here? Okay, I see that he has a specialized hat on. That's a synthetic, like a waterproof or quick dry. And he's got his binoculars. He's obviously very intent. He's very focused. So I'm feeling like he's spotting the bird, and then next thing you know, the binoculars are going to pop up and he's going to be zooming in and trying to find out what it is. So if this guy showed up for my wildflower hike, I'm going to actually maybe try to ask him ahead of time, like, hey, what have you seen this morning? You know, I'm going to hear what kind of birds he's into. And I might even say, well, if we have any birds, join us on our wildflower hike, then I hope you'll help me out with some bird questions. So he's ready to jump in. Okay, here's the light version of that retractable harness I mentioned. So this one actually, you just drop down. They actually have them too that are kind of elastic loaded that bring it back to your chest. Okay, again, he's got kind of the quick dry shirt. He looks pretty ready for being outside in the sun. Okay, how about this group? You guys see some clues here? Do we think they're ready to sit down for our hour-long campfire program? Okay, we probably need something much more energetic happening here, right? Or this group is here for the fun. They're the facilitators. We've got that a little bit of experience seeking. And they're probably not interested in sitting down for an educational program. It looks like they really want to get out there and run and have fun and have an exciting day as a family. So it's more of the family experience time that they're looking for out here in the beach. Okay, how about this pair? All right, so I'm seeing that they have the dog with them. Thankfully, he has it on a leash. So in parks, I'd be happy with that. He's ready to go on the walk. Our lady has a walking stick, which can just be a walking stick can be just helping somebody take a longer walk than they could otherwise, or it might actually be needed. So I'm probably going to be watching for some clues on stability to see if she's really relying on that, and maybe adjusting the route that we're taking if we're doing a hike. Or we might be, I might be inviting her, if these were just walk-in guests, I might be inviting her to, hey, join our birding program on the deck, versus recommending the hike, because our trails in particular are pretty strenuous and include stairs. They're pretty quick elevation changes. So I'd want to be thinking about how she's doing with stability. Okay, how about this pair? So again, we have walking sticks. In this case, they're on the top of a mountain. So I would guess the walking sticks are probably for stabilizing and for safety, more than necessarily something they're relying on, that they probably have good stability. They both look well prepared. We've got some high ankle hiking boots, different layers. Although it looks like she might be having to kind of urge that kid on. He doesn't look like he's 100% there. But again, just reading body language and reading the spacing with our group. Okay. So we just try to look at our audience and read visual clues whenever we have them. We're trying to kind of make those judgments. And like I said, some things you're going to have to kind of watch your group and see what questions come up and see how they're interacting with the space, or maybe watching for any clues that anybody's struggling, especially if you're doing a hike program. There's a lot of different impacts in how people experience that. They might be perfectly fine when you start the hike and then have slightly twisted an ankle or something as you go. So you also need to be prepared for those safety situations as well. So we're usually always carrying a first aid kit or something with us. I guess in the master gardener context, you might have somebody who really is gung-ho and wants to help shovel all the dirt and shovel all the mulch, and really quickly overdoes it. So we want to be mindful of our group and what they need. Okay. So I want to kind of shift gears, and we're going to get into an acronym for interpretation to help us kind of remember all these different pieces. So one of those quotes from Tilden is that interpretation is a voyage of discovery. In the field of human emotions and intellectual growth, it's hard to foresee that time when an interpreter can confidently say, now we are wholly adequate to the task. So again, this is a little bit obtuse language, but I think what he's really getting at is you're never 100% there. You're never going to know it all. You're always going to need to say, I don't know. And I love that somebody in the chat earlier said that as master gardeners in your program, you practice as a whole group saying, I don't know. That's an excellent tool. But realize that you're always growing and you're always practicing, and practice is what gets you better. Practice is what helps you to do all of these things quicker and more easily. So now I want to get into an acronym that can help you to remember some of these different parts when we talk about interpretation. So we went over the principles from Tilden. We're going to kind of break down a toolbox, but to help you remember the toolbox, we're going to use the acronym of poetry. So we're going to talk about the poetry of interpretation, and this will help you to remember an easy checklist for these different items when you're thinking about your programs and planning your programs. So the first piece is the P. We say that interpretation has a purpose. And remember at the very beginning when I said it's a mission-based communication process, that P, the purpose, is all about how do you meet the mission of your site. So we think about our themes in interpretation, which we're going to expand on in just a little bit, but we also think about what are the goals and objectives. What are we aiming to accomplish? And so with our goals, and the terminology can get a little tricky here because if you've ever heard of SMART goals actually are objectives. So it just depends on whose terminology you're using. So you're either saying goals versus SMART goals or goals versus objectives. It's two different ways of saying basically the same thing. So goals generally is that thing you want to accomplish. So I'm guessing many of you have made New Year's resolutions in the past. So what happens with New Year's resolutions? A lot of us, January comes around, it's a new year. We want it to be a new year, a new you. You might think of something you really want to accomplish. And a lot of times it falls flat, right? So we actually, in gyms, even our yoga studio, we see attendance pop up really high in January and February. And by the end of February, it's opened up and there's a lot of space again. So we see a lot of those New Year's resolutions kind of taper out. And that's because those usually are a goal and not an objective. So just to give you an example, for several years, I envied a guy who had hundreds of songs and stories stored in his head. So he could sing a song or tell a story just right off the cuff. And I just thought it was amazing. And I thought, I want to be like that guy. So for a couple of years, I was thinking, okay, I want to do that. And I wish I knew more stuff. I'm going to try to learn some more stuff. I'm going to try to add to my repertoire. And that didn't work. So for that couple of years, sure, I would maybe memorize one or two things during the year, but that was all that really happened because life gets in the way. So what I did instead is I made it an objective. So the objective is what results do I actually expect? And I want it to meet all those things that you would have in a SMART goal. It's going to be specific, it's going to be measurable, it's going to be achievable, something that's actually feasible to do. It's going to be time sensitive. It's something that's realistic and time sensitive so that I know when I'm measuring it, how I'm measuring it, and exactly what I'm doing to accomplish that goal. So if the goal was, I want to learn more repertoire, I actually had an objective one year where I said, okay, I think it is reasonable, given the amount of time it takes me to memorize a song, which technically, if I really focus, I could do in a couple of days, but I wanted to not only memorize it, but work it up to where it was a good performance quality. So I thought, okay, a month is more than enough time to do that. So I decided that was the achievable, that was the thing that made it realistic. And that year I set an objective for my New Year's resolution where I said, I want to memorize this year. I will memorize one song per month. And that year I actually managed to memorize 14 or 15 pieces instead of 12. So you might say, hey, that's more than the number of months. Well, that's because a couple of extra special requests came in, like a friend's wedding where they wanted me to do something. So I added that into the mix. So after that year and that being successful, I've now kept that as an objective ongoing because I decided a month really was a good, nice, achievable time frame. And now that I've done it for 5 years, I think now, I'm up to that number of songs. So I'm at 60 plus and just have a lot of stuff now in my head that's ready to go. So I'm now catching up. I'm nowhere near caught up with the guy I admired that made me come up with this goal, but it has moved me along that way by just making it an objective, making it specific, also adding accountability. So for personal goals in particular, accountability where somebody's checking in, somebody else knows that you've said publicly, I want to memorize a thing every month. And I actually told friends, you can stop me and say, what's this month's song? And I should be able to perform it for you. So that was one of the ways of challenging myself and having that accountability. For our programs, what we do is we apply our creativity as interpreters to figure out how we will measure our objectives. So our goal might be like, I want people to understand the importance of monarchs in the landscape or the importance of landscaping for the monarchs. What does that mean to them? The objectives could be very specific. And I use this monarch example because I had a previous CIG student who really did an amazing job with her objectives for her final program. She had a program at her site, and I believe at the time she was at Cromwell Valley Park in Baltimore, and they would do a monarch tag and release. So within the context of the program, these participants got to tag a monarch and then do the monarch release. That's a wonderful, like, emotional connection to this little insect, which insects are, kind of hard to get people loving, but butterflies are a lot easier than some of our others. So they had this emotional experience where they got to do this monarch release and send it on its way. And they were connecting that to the topic. So she wrote 3 objectives that were really, really wonderful. And I always love to share them as an example. So the first one, she said at least 50%. So we usually write it as a greater than or equal to with a number. And 50% is kind of the minimum. So that's like at least a majority of my people got it, right? They understood what I was talking about. So she actually said, I want to provoke my audience so that at least 50% of them, the majority of them, will seek further information. Okay, so that's one way of saying it. They'll seek further information. And what she did was offered a pile of brochures. So she said at the end of the program, hey, if you're interested in learning more about what you can plant to support monarchs in your landscape or any butterflies in your landscape, I have brochures here on butterfly gardening. Feel free to pick one up and take it with you. These are plants that do well locally. Okay, so you can see how in the context of the program, before my audience has gotten away, I'm measuring my objective by having it specific and having it casual. So it's not like I'm doing a pre-test and a post-test. I mean, you're doing that for the Master Gardener program, I believe also like they do for Master Naturalist. So you're doing a pre-test and a post-test because they want to specifically measure how much you've learned from this whole program. But in the context of a 1-hour wildflower walk or butterfly program, I'm not going to give my audience a pre-test and a post-test. That would be weird. So instead, we're going to do this in a way that's very casual, very approachable. So it's very easy at the end to say, hey, if you're interested in more information, I have a brochure here. Now, the sneaky part is that she had counted the brochures that she put out so that after her program, she could count how many were taken. And that way she has a measure of, did a majority of her attendees take a brochure? So if 20 people showed up for my talk and at least 10 of them took the brochure, I've met my objective. That I provoked enough interest that they wanted to learn more about butterfly gardening and they took this brochure. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? That like we have a higher measure for something that's easier. Okay, it's very low effort on the part of our audience. to say, yes, I'd love to know more. I hope you've had this cool experience and they're really excited and want more. They might even ask you for it if you haven't offered it as part of the program. Now, what she did was she had another objective that was asking for a higher buy-in from the audience. So she was asking for a higher level of engagement. So she lowered the percentage. So she said, I'd really love at least 30% to sign up for the butterfly gardening workshop. So she's asking for a bigger thing. She's asking you to commit like next Saturday morning for 4 hours to come learn about butterfly gardening on site. So she had that objective written, at least greater than or equal to 30% of my audience will attend the gardening workshop. They're going to seek much more in-depth information, right? They're seeking further information, but in a much more concrete way. So what she did was say, if you're interested in more information, you can pick up the brochure, or if you'd like to join us for a hands-on butterfly gardening workshop next Saturday, the sign-up sheet is here on the clipboard. So she had that ready, again, a physical object, which I also encourage you to do as an interpreter, because that's going to remind you that you need to measure your objective at the end when you have this stack of stuff sitting on your table that you need to remember to go through. That's going to help you remember to ask these. But she also then had a way to directly measure that they were signing up for the gardening workshop. The really cool thing, not that coming back for a gardening workshop isn't cool enough, but she now had a third thing. She actually wanted impact. She said, what I really want to know is, do they go home and plant habitat? Are they helping us expand the habitat for butterflies? Are they going to go home and plant a butterfly garden? That's what I really want to know. Well, you might say, how do we measure that in the context of the program? She couldn't, but as I say with interpreters, we apply our creativity to figure out how to measure it. So what she did was she said a much lower percentage, because this was a bigger ask, right? Now I'm asking you to go buy plants and install them, to do hard work, to dig holes and get this whole process going. So she lowered that percentage and said, I'll be happy if 10% of the attendees of my program, so either 10 or 15% will plant a butterfly garden at home and let me know about it by tagging us on social media with photos of their butterfly garden. So the way you could do that with a physical cue is to give yourself like a business card with your hashtags and your social media outlets printed on it, so that you can give that to somebody and say, hey, do at Locust Grove Nature Center, hashtag butterfly garden, and we'll get to see your photos that you've shared of your garden. And you want to encourage people to share on their social media anyway, because, if we want more people gardening, more people seeing other people's gardens is going to help build that growth and excitement. So we're keeping that whole ball rolling. Here's the really cool thing. This gave her 3 objectives at a different tier. So each one of them was asking for a different level of commitment from her audience. But they had just had this awesome physical and emotional experience of releasing a monarch, sending it out into the world on its way, that she could use that emotional leverage to then provoke them into wanting more information, learning more, and maybe even going out and doing something about it. And those measurable objectives were then stacked so that they tiered on those different levels in order to create that connection and for her to measure it in the context of her program. The only one that she had to wait a while was the butterfly garden installation. But she did decide that was kind of a pie in the sky. That was the ideal thing, was to go home and plant habitat, but she knew it was a big ask. So I hope that makes sense, how they're layered in those different numbers and those different quantities, but also they're feasible. They're something that you can apply your creativity and figure out, how can I ask it in a question? How can I offer a brochure or offer more information? How can I ask them to sign up for the next program? So you're doing that while they're at that immediate stage of they're excited about what they just learned, they're excited about the program, and you're able to measure it right then and there. Because how many of you have probably deleted emails that come to you all the time? Now everything wants a review, everything wants a rating, everything wants a feedback survey. So it really can get overwhelming. And we know that if we send a survey and said, tell us, how much more you want to learn about monarch butterflies and butterfly gardening, that's probably going to be much less effective than asking right there in the context of the program. So while we have that captive audience, we want to connect the dots and get that information from them. And then this will connect back to our themes and sub-themes, because there we're going to ask the so what and the why does it matter. So I want to give you an example. So here, the example, the goal might be to encourage an understanding of fire ecology management among park visitors. So I would like our park visitors to understand why fire ecology is important. It's really cool that this is now becoming a thing out west. They're having so many of these catastrophic wildfires, and they're realizing that they haven't done fire management enough, that they're returning to indigenous peoples to learn about fire management that the indigenous people have practiced for centuries before European colonization. And they're also going back to places like the Southeast. They're hiring burn bosses out of Florida who've been doing prescribed burning there in Florida because it was our fire dependent ecosystems that needed that they're now bringing those people out west to teach them how to do more burn management and fire ecology. So this is an example from out west. The photo is out west. That's not in the Southeast. That they want to encourage an understanding of fire ecology management. You want your public to understand that it's not all what they saw in the movie Bambi, that fire isn't bad, and that we need to move beyond fire being bad to have a deeper understanding. So the objective, or an example of one objective, is to decrease the number of accidental human-induced fires in the park in a year. So within 1 year, we want fewer number of reports. So just to give you a personal example, in Florida, when I said I was on our prescribed burn team, one of our goals or one of our objectives was reduce the number of false call-ins reporting fires from our surrounding neighbors. So we decided we need to do a better job of informing our neighbors about our burn program so that they understood when a notice came out that we were in the window for a prescribed burn, that if they smelled smoke or they saw smoke, that a burn was happening at the park property and that was controlled, it was on purpose, it was safe, and it wasn't something to call the fire department about. So you have different ways that management goals and management objectives can be also built into an interpretive program and how we're measuring our interpretive objectives. So when we craft an outline for a presentation, and I'm just giving you a super generic version, there are NAI versions of an outline and there's MPS versions of an outline. But kind of for a broad perspective, we want to think about that goal. What's the goal of the program? What are those objectives? We're going to think about our theme. And then in our outline, we're going to create the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Now, this outline piece is the next letter in our poetry acronym. So our P was that interpretation was purposeful, that it had that mission, goal, and objectives. Okay, that first piece. The O is that it's organized. So organized is just like any of you who've ever written a 5-paragraph essay, right? You had that intro, the body, and the conclusion. In an interpretive outline or interpretive program, the introduction and the conclusion are both going to be stating our theme. And the theme is our T in our poetry acronym, so that it's thematic. So we're stating the theme in the intro and in the conclusion, and the body is going to be our sub-themes that are written the same way, but they all support the overarching theme. So for this format, you can think about the theme as being the one take-home message. Like if your audience leaves knowing nothing else about what you covered today, you want them to remember this thing. So that theme should be the statement of your take-home message. And the theme also answers the so what, and it is the basest version of the story that's connecting your tangibles and intangibles, or at least one of your tangibles and an intangible. So it is kind of that connecting arc. And I'm sure all of you know, if you've ever planned a party or something like that, that it's much easier to do if you have a theme, right? The theme takes it just from a topic, but the theme kind of gives you a box to work inside of. So it also helps limit your choices enough to make it doable, to make all those choices, make it much easier to make all those choices. So if I know I'm planning a Halloween party, like that now creates my bounding box, which kind of brings everything in and makes it much quicker and easier to pull everything together. So your theme is sort of similar. your theme for your program is going to give you like that ultimate take-home message, and it helps get you focused. It helps to bring in all of your ideas so that you're looking just for things that are going to support your theme. And I will suggest that you be pretty brutal in your self-edit process so that you are actually pruning away everything that doesn't belong, that isn't there to fit your theme. You might think of a really cool activity, but if it doesn't support the theme of the program and support the purpose of the program, then why is it there? Okay, it maybe belongs in something else. So you want to think about that whole planning process when you're pulling together all of your content to think about how it supports the theme. All right, our E in the poetry analogy is that interpretation is enjoyable. How do we make it enjoyable? Okay, we want to remember that entertainment is not the main goal, but that all good communication is entertaining. Remember that a formal setting might turn off your audience. Okay, we want to keep things kind of casual and conversational, even if we are in a more formal setting, like maybe you're doing a campfire program and you have sort of amphitheater seating, that you're keeping that so that it feels very comfortable and very conversational. Like I said, when we're measuring our objectives, we're thinking about how to make that very conversational and make it fit in the whole setting of what we're presenting. We also want to think about the use of humor. Now, you have to be careful with humor because we want to make sure that our humor is still related, that it's still relevant to the program and relevant to what we're doing, but also that we're not insulting anybody or using stereotypes or anything like that. So a lot of times I use self-deprecating humor. When I'm doing a program, I might talk about, hey, the first time I tried this, like, you know, I really had difficulty with it, or I really messed up. Here's why, or here's what I learned from that. So you might have humor as a part of your program. I would also say that enjoyable doesn't always mean it's fun. Okay. Enjoyable doesn't always mean your audience is smiling. When we say all good communication is entertaining or is enjoyable, it can be enjoyable in the way that it's engaging. Okay. If your audience is fully engaged in the topic, you could be talking about a very difficult subject and it's going to still engage the audience. They're still going to walk away saying that was an amazing program. Even though, like, I've done programs that make people cry. Okay, so I'm not always looking for the smiling face. I'm sometimes looking for just like the focus. You know, you might even be talking about a topic where you're looking for that visual body language that tells you that somebody's like introspecting. So you're really engaging your audience, and that is inherently enjoyable. It's just enjoyable in a different way than smiling or laughing. Okay, so when we say humor, I just don't want you to get distracted that like it's all about having a fun time. It can be very impactful and very engaging if it's on a very serious subject as well. Okay, also keep in mind that making it enjoyable was also all those multi-sensory pieces. So using music, like I said, that's kind of a go-to that's very easy to incorporate, especially if you're working with younger audiences. Like anybody can rewrite the words to Itsy Bitsy Spider. And even if you say you can't sing, that's basically talk singing. So it's definitely something you can do. And it definitely can bring a lot of illustration to your program, kind of create that heart connection right off the bat. People really relate to music in a very direct way. Also thinking about those multi-sensory things. So I'd like you all to just close your eyes for a moment. Just close your eyes, and I want you to picture the first brand new box of crayons you got as a kid. It might have been an 8-pack, a 16, or a 64, whatever size it was. I want you to imagine that first brand new box of crayons you received as a child. And now I want you to imagine opening it. What does it smell like? Okay, now if we were in person, I could look around and probably a lot of you would be smiling. Why is that? How do you have that connection? Well, the trick here is that scent is one of the strongest senses that relates to our amygdala, which is our reptile brain. It's right back here at the back of our skull. And that reptile brain is more strongly connected to scent, and it connects directly to emotion. And so a scent memory, or a scent that triggers a memory, can actually have a much stronger emotional response than any other multisensory thing we can include. So we really want to think a lot about how we're incorporating senses in our programs, and either be intentional or be cautious when we're handling different kinds of scents, because the scent can really create that emotional connection. And I think as master gardeners, you guys have a wonderful sensory palette to work with when you're doing programs, because plants provide you with so many things. You've got wonderful textures for people to touch. You have probably most of your plants are going to be safe to touch, but you have those textures. You also have the soil itself, all these textures and all these scents. I'm sure that in this group, I could say, like, imagine the smell of soil that's just been warmed by the sun. Even on a cold day like today, if you went out and got a handful of good soil that's been sitting in the sun, I bet you can all imagine what that smells like in a very direct and detailed way. And it doesn't mean we're always making our audience imagine. If we were in person, I'd be passing around something for you to smell. But over the virtual environment, we do what we can. The fact that you can imagine it viscerally is because you have so much experience with it. So it connects to your previous experience. It connects to what you know, and what you know in a very direct way. So think about how to incorporate all those sensory pieces that are also going to make your program enjoyable. So some other techniques that add to the enjoyment: smile. Okay. Again, this is if for most of our topics, we can smile. We might have some topics where that's not appropriate, but it really does help to engage your audience. It helps them to see you as not only approachable, but also that you're excited about it. So it shows your passion for your subject. We use active verbs. We like to show the cause and effect, kind of connect the dots for people. That's part of that holistic picture, showing the big picture. If we're talking about science, it's really good to link that science to human history, or link it to experiences within your audience. Those are ways that people can help connect. It can help them relate, and that relatable is also enjoyable. We're also using maybe visual metaphors. So that would be like that big banner with the bear silhouettes that I described, or talking about maybe leaf shapes. Maybe you're helping people identify some plants, and you're talking about, something being palmate. Well, palmate describes that it looks just like the palm of my hand, and it's going to have leaflets that resemble fingers that are all connected in the center. So something that's a visual metaphor is going to help you connect. Also, maybe having a vehicle. So that is something that's helping you to connect to the resource and show the story, something that's carrying the story. Or maybe this overriding analogy, like you've got some kind of parallel story that you're using to create that overall idea. We also might use something like a contrived situation. So I might say, imagine that you're in this place and you have to grow the food for your family for the next year. And here you have this much space to do it. What would you do? How are you going to solve this situation? Okay, also thinking about personification. So this might really help you with helping somebody care about a plant, is thinking about, what does it need? Okay, what are the plant's needs? Well, the plant does literally have needs, but most people are going to relate that to their own needs. So they're kind of personifying as they think about the needs of another living thing. Humans inherently think we're the center of the universe. So people tend to think of it in that personification process. And then maybe focusing on an individual. So as I said, if you have a name tag or something, or I might see that somebody just had that little light up moment, and I'm going to focus in and say, tell me what you just saw. What did you see there that just got you so excited? And there might be something really cool that comes out of that for the whole group. All right, I want to circulate 2 themes. So we've covered P. Our P was purpose. Our O was organized. We're connecting everything back to that overarching theme, and we're wrapping it up with the theme. The E was enjoyable, and the T is thematic. So we want to think about that theme, which was connected both in our organized, being the intro and the conclusion, and it was answering the so what, which was part of our purposeful, right? So themes are messages as a whole. We want to keep it a short, simple, complete sentence. We use a complete sentence because that forces us to have a complete idea. So we want to think about the theme being that complete sentence and having that whole idea all together. We want to express just one idea. So if this is the one take-home message, we really want to focus so that we get to that one idea. We also want to answer the so what question. So I want you to imagine that dragged along visitor, okay, that one person who's there, whose family got them to come along and they're hanging out in the back, they're not looking very interested in your program. I want them to be the person you're trying to reach. Focus all of your attention, or at least half of your attention, on trying to connect. And once you connect to that person, I want you to think about them also saying, why should I care? So what? And you're thinking about that in your theme. So you're imagining them as you're writing your theme and thinking about the so what. Remember, we also said it's going to connect tangibles and intangibles. You might not get plural in both of these. You might not have multiple tangibles and multiple intangibles in the theme. It might just be one, but you might just pick which one's your strongest, which one really drives home your take-home message. If you think about this being the one thing you want your audience to leave with, then that really helps you to connect to that so what, to get it all included. We also want it to be specific and interesting. So we're really getting something that's catchy and something that helps our audience to focus. So I want to give you a couple of examples. So let's say the theme is fire quickly becomes a friend or a foe of the forest. And then as an example, I might have subthemes. Now those subthemes are written the same way. It's still a complete sentence. But my subthemes that support this might be managed fire consumes excess fuels and contributes to a healthy forest. Fire returns food to the forest floor and feeds the next generation of plants. And plants and animals flourish where fires once ravaged the forest. Can you guys see how this builds a kind of progressive understanding as we move through the program? So this clearly gives us that body. If the intro was fire can quickly become a friend or foe of the forest, then we have this body, which is built of these sub-themes, where we're stepping our way through and connecting all of those dots with the sub-themes. And then we're going to restate our theme at the end. We might restate it in a slightly different way. So I might restate it as a question, which is still going to count because I'm still driving home that take-home message, but maybe I'm going to restate it as, now I want you to all think about what you can do to change fire to be a friend versus a foe of the forest. So a lot of alliteration here. Interpreters love alliteration. I'd say we're a lot like Norse poets that way. Oh, I had one more subtheme here. The careless fires of mankind still can threaten future forest resources. So that might lead right into restating that theme as a question. What can you do about it? All right. We also, beyond looking at our themes, and I will say for themes, that takes some creativity. A couple recommendations for when you're writing your themes. It is a good idea to you've come up with like one quick idea of a theme statement, is to come up with as many as you can, just sort of spitball them all out, get them all on paper. I like to use a whiteboard or an easel pad and kind of put them all up there so I can see them clearly. And then we go through this process of what we call wordsmithing, which is looking at all the ways you've said all those different parts of your theme and really thinking about what way the wording can work best. So you might come up with a way to say something that, whether it uses alliteration or not, you might not be stuck on that. Like a lot of our interpreters really love it. But whatever way you come up with saying it, there's going to be some way that you can get the words to click where you're just like, that sounds really nice. And when it sounds nice, it also makes it more memorable. So it's going to work better as a take-home message. It's going to work better as that one thing that your audience remembers from your program. Okay, so just to give you another fun example, one of my CIG courses I did out on the Eastern Shore for the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway tour operators. One of those was actually doing her presentation at the end about Smith Island and the Smith Island cakes, but she was also talking about the history of the island and how that came to be a thing, and how that being kind of a sub-industry of its own is now helping support people being able to still live there and keep up this livelihood on the island. And her theme statement was written, and I probably won't remember it exactly word for word, but it was written something like, a bite of Smith Island cake is a taste of history and culture in every forkful. So you can see where she wordsmithed that. She came up with this way to make you really think about like the taste of the cake and to connect that to how it's representing the history and the culture. And then she was supporting that throughout the program. She also really used those sensory pieces very well, because she brought a Smith Island cake to talk about during the program to show us the layers, but then she gave everybody a piece of cake at the end. So a great way to incorporate some sensory stimulation to help drive the message home. All right, so I want to get to our R. Our R is that interpretation is relevant. So relevant was like the reveal and the relate kind of combined, where we're looking at how this has meaning to the audience, what does it mean to them, and how is it connecting to them. So we want to think about how we're relating to our audience, and this is really about putting the audience first. So we want interpretation to be personal. We want it to connect to something that our audience cares about, and we want it to be meaningful, that it has context, that they understand it, it relates to their worldview, and it helps them to go beyond something that they know about or care about, but help give them something new to know about and care about, but it's connected to something that's already in their experience. So that's how we're relating to our audience. And we've already talked a lot about kind of understanding what the audience is seeing in the resource and how they might have related to it before. We can use our questions to get to know them. And then we're connecting all of that throughout the program as we go. So ways to make it meaningful, we can think about bridging the unfamiliar or the familiar to the unfamiliar. So what is something they already know and can relate to? And then how are we helping to connect that to the new thing? If the resource that we're talking about is something completely new to them, how are we helping them to connect to it? Are we using those universals? Are we asking questions so that we understand their previous experience that we're able to create a tie to? How are we pulling those pieces together? Also, how do we make it personal? Well, I already gave you one of those tools that we talk about our universals. We're using family, home, love, connection, belonging, all of those things that are really ways that people can self-reference, if they're thinking about that. There's also some language tools that we use. So shadowing is like using people's names, connecting to your audience directly, calling out that person who looked interested in something, and maybe using selective attention. So thinking about how you can hear your own child's voice in a crowd. Like it's going to stick out when somebody says mommy, if it's your kid's mommy or somebody else's, right? So we have that selective attention that helps us to focus and helps us to filter when there's too much going on in the world around us. So even with all that stuff going on, we tend to focus on what we care about, which means even with a whole presentation, like even the 3 hours I'm giving you this morning, there will be pieces of this that each of you is going to remember a different thing from today. And it's because your selective attention makes you focus on the things that you care about most. So maybe you're really focused on audience, or you're really focused on the objectives piece, or you're really focused on the story piece. All of those different things are going to be related to something that's in your personal experience that helps you to focus and attend to the thing you care most about. We also use self-referencing. Now, self-referencing doesn't mean me, although I might tell personal stories, and that can help my audience to relate to why I care about the thing. But self-referencing is getting people to reference themselves. So these are really easy to incorporate and a really direct way to relate to your audience. So think of the last time you watched a sunset. Think of the last time you joined a big group in person. That would be really, really relevant for the last couple of years. When was the last time you went inside a store to shop? Have you ever planted a tree? Have you ever paddled a kayak? Have you ever felt like your story wasn't being heard? Or I might ask, how many of you have ever paddled before? Okay, I might need that information as a critical data point, but I'm also getting them thinking about that experience. How many of you have ever watched the moon rise? How many of you have planted a garden? Or how many of you grew up in a house or with a home or a family that grew a garden? How many of you consider yourself gardeners? Gardeners are very different from landscapers. So that self-referencing, you can see there's lots of ways you can adapt this to fit your program, to reference your topic or your theme, but also be automatically tapping into your visitor's own experience. So I just want to wrap up that the poetry of interpretation is that it's purposeful, it's organized, it's enjoyable, it's thematic, it's relevant, and the most important piece is you. And this is that passion piece. You can't fake it if you don't care. Okay, your audience is always going to know if you're passionate about your topic, if you really care about your subject. I always say that Angela's second rule of interpretation is that you have to be flexible. You have to be ready to think on your feet, because Mama Nature doesn't play fair. You might be out there to do a wonderful gardening program in the demonstration garden, and the hawk comes down and catches a snake right beside your group, and you just lost everybody's attention. So you need to be ready to be flexible, to be ready to incorporate that into the lesson, to maybe talk about how the food ecosystem is healthy there because of this healthy garden, and you're pulling all those pieces back together. So you need to be able to think on your feet, and also to take care of the care and feeding of yourself and your passion. So you might be passionate about a subject, you might be passionate about your resource, but you also need to think about, what do you do to keep yourself focused, to keep yourself fed and watered, as it were, to take care of your basic needs as an interpreter and as a person who's sharing the story of our resources, as the person who has the privilege of being the voice for the voiceless, of being the voice for the resource. And so I hope you can take all of the tools we've covered today and go out there and speak for the trees, speak for the plants, speak for the gardens and the soil and the microbes and all of those other wonderful things you get to share as master gardeners, and really do it with the passion that you have. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and give us some time for questions.
Awesome. That was so incredible. Thank you so much. I think that was just such a perfect skill, and it translates incredibly well to everything that we do in our gardens. And I think we're super fortunate to have had this basic introduction to how do we engage people to see the natural world and care about it the way that we do, and maybe try to encourage them to form their own connection, or maybe to remember a connection that they had to it in the past that perhaps they hadn't thought about for a while. So thank you so much. We don't actually have any questions in the Q&A, so folks, this is your opportunity. If you were thinking of questions throughout the presentation, but you were just so engaged and forgot to put your question into the Q&A, feel free to do that now. But in the meantime,
typing definitely uses a different part of your brain, so I totally understand. A couple of extra things I will mention is, if you like this and you'd like to know more, I would invite you to check out the Certified Interpretive Guide through the National Association for Interpretation. It sounds like we might have a few people who already are CIG or NAI certified. There's the Certified Interpretive Guide program, which is for frontline interpreters, people who actually are out there giving programs. There's also the Certified Interpretive Host certification, which is for anybody else who works at an interpretive site. So you might not be the frontline interpreter, you might be working the reception desk, or you might be the gardener outside pulling the weeds, because guess what? The public doesn't care. As long as they see a logo or a uniform, they're going to ask you the question. And we really hope that everybody can communicate effectively, not just the interpretive staff. Or
Absolutely
volunteers.
true. And it doesn't even have to be the logo for the organization.
Right. It doesn't even have to be where you
Any
are.
type of logo makes you.
I can go to IKEA wearing my Parks logo and somebody will ask me questions.
Yes.
Although I've discovered here, like even in my HOA, I've been off the pathway identifying trees, and apparently I give off such strong park ranger vibes that I've had middle school age boys like pass me on scooters and then do a U-turn and come back to ask me questions. And that's with no logo, no uniform, nothing, nothing to indicate that I know anything. But so just it's two ways that we look at training, as we try to train frontline staff and also all of the support staff. If you are interested in that, I would say probably best to email Stephanie and let her know. And if you give me those email addresses, Stephanie, what I do is I have a Google email list that's just for when a training is actually set up. So when I set one up here locally, if you're in the Bethesda area, although right now for the pandemic, we've actually had a waiver that allowed us to do CIG virtually.
Nice.
It is a different experience virtually.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
And it's still 32 hours, but we spread it out over more days. Whereas in person, it might be 4 days. They have 8 hours a day, but we usually spread it out if it's virtually, because sitting in front of a screen is just too much for a full day. So,
yes.
So we might be offering it virtually. I probably will be scheduling a class in like January, February, March, just because that's the best time of year for us. So if you'd like to get on that email list, I only email out when a class is actually scheduled and opening for registration. And that list gets a heads up before it goes public. So I'm usually setting up a program for park staff, and we have a few park staff in each session. And then we open up all the extra seats to the public, which has been cool with the virtual, because we've had students from Canada to Hawaii participating. So it's really fun to have people from all different sites. So I want to give you that option. Also at Locust Grove, like we have lots of gardening projects, so we would welcome any help. And particularly if you'd love to come and help us develop and offer some great gardening interpretation programs, we'd love to do that. So we're working on reviving our pollinator garden, our critter care garden, which is just vegetables, and also our native plant demonstration gardens.
Very cool. Excellent. Thank you for that info. We can send out a follow-up to everyone too that has the CIG information. We did get one question that came in that says, are there similar YouTube presentations that add to this information and provide additional practical application?
Probably. I don't have that as a list off the top of my head.
Is there just a certain resource that you think is a good, dependable one for interpretation?
Well, I would look to anything that NAI offers. So, and I think NAI isn't, it's not YouTube. What's the other really common platform?
Vimeo? For videos?
Yeah, videos.
Vimeo.
Vimeo. Okay. I kept thinking Venmo, and I'm like, it's not that. That's a payment thing. Vimeo. So they use Vimeo, but through the website, there are some links there for resources. The NAI website, it's interpnet.com, has some resources. And I think once you get on their like Vimeo channel, there's a bunch of stuff there. Also in parks, under our parks YouTube, Montgomery Parks YouTube, if you're just looking for interpretive style presentations, there were a lot of presentations we did over the pandemic. So obviously we've all flipped and done more virtual programming. There's a lot of virtual programming available there. I know they have also a webinar that I did on native plant gardening. Nice. Planting for abundance in your landscape. Yay, love it. Which is more lecture style than interpretation, but still there are a lot of good samples out there. And I think you can certainly find local and relevant information. Like DNR has also done wonderful presentations. I know Carrie Wickstead has moved to another position, but did some amazing talks all through the pandemic. And those are available through DNR's links.
Awesome. Yeah, so definitely lots of great resources, and we'll follow up in an email afterwards with all those resources. So before we go, I just want to say thanks again, Angela. I would definitely check out the chat for all these kudos that folks are
Okay.
giving you. It was just such an incredibly informative, and a lot of folks also said an inspiring presentation. So thank you. And I also just want to shout out Caitlin, our coordinator for the Master Gardener program in Charles County, as she did recommend this topic for this continuing education event for our volunteers. And I think she was spot on. I think a lot of folks are going to be using this information that they've learned today. So thanks so much to Caitlin for that. All right, everyone. So that's all. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.